So our girl reincarnated into a romance novel. Nothing new, we've seen this before. Girl dies, wakes up in a book, she already knows exactly how it ends. She knows who the real leads are. She knows every plot twist, every tragedy, and most importantly, she knows exactly what she needs to do to survive. Except this one have a little twist to it. When she was hired to work at the Duke's mansion, she kept that rule close. But she didn't expect things to take a completely different turn. Somehow, she ended up becoming the personal story reader for the Duke himself, who just happens to be blind. And honestly, she wasn't worried. A little extra money, a clean exit. After all, he's blind. How would he ever notice if one insignificant servant just disappeared? Yeah, we all know that's not how this goes. Because the Duke was beautiful. Dangerously, unfairly beautiful. And that black blindfold somehow made him even more mysterious, even more magnetic. And the more time they spent together, the more he started to notice her, just her, in a way she was absolutely not prepared for. Things escalated fast and way out of her control. And that's when our story begins with a blindfolded young man asking the protagonist how she was living in the ducal castle. And she explains that she felt very comfortable there, thanking the man for his attention and care toward her. The girl was smiling from ear to ear as she reaffirmed how much she loved living there. She just thought about her new warm, cozy, and soft bed that our girl had never slept in before, plus eating only delicious food. But the most important thing was that this job paid her a very high salary. For all these things, the MC was sure that the Duke's castle was the best place in the world to live. Hearing so many compliments, the boy with the black blindfold asked if it was really true. But before the MC could even respond, he bombarded her with the following proposal. "Then marry me." Her eyes widened in an instant. The girl even thought she might have misheard his words, so she asked the Duke to repeat what he had just said. But when he repeated it, it became clear that she wasn't imagining things, and he had really proposed to her. Even so, her nervousness didn't pass, and the girl began babbling about how she probably had some hearing problem, and that she probably needed to see a doctor. But before she could escape the conversation, the Duke asked her to sit down again. And so she did. It's not like she had any choice there. Still, the girl stared at him in shock. Getting engaged to a common commoner, what was the Duke thinking? She even started to think he was messing with her again. Trying to lighten the mood, the MC said the Duke was being more playful than usual that day, and even offered to read today's report aloud to him, changing the subject. But of course, the Duke wasn't going to let that slide. So he questioned if that was really what she wanted from this life, which made the girl ask what he meant. Then he calls her by her full name, Lady Marinschfence, making the girl sweat with nervousness. She had spent all the time in the castle trying to hide her true origin, but he knew everything. Continuing, the boy reveals that he knew she had hidden her connection to the noble family to enter the ducal castle and work, and asked if it wasn't because she wanted to get something out of it. Marin was totally stunned. She couldn't believe she had been unmasked like that, and all she wanted to do was run far away from there. But that certainly wouldn't be possible. Instead, she had to listen to the Duke coldly ask if perhaps she thought she could deceive the Duchy of Vines so easily. The poor girl was really feeling sick. She swore her acting was perfect, and she had no idea what could have gone wrong. Now the only certainty she had was that her end was near. A short time ago, the girl lived in a small house surrounded by nature. On one of the mornings, she entered her mother's room, who was looking out at the landscape through the window. With a breakfast tray in hand, the girl asks if the woman was already awake, to which she responds by asking if Marin had slept well. The lady seemed tired, despite loving her daughter very much. Excited, the girl held out the tray, saying she had brought delicious honey biscuits and an amazing soup for breakfast. But her mother said she would eat later, asking the young girl to worry about herself. The problem is that every day she promised to eat, but she didn't, and Marin saw her strength diminishing more and more. But the woman asked her not to worry, because she had only slept poorly and therefore had no appetite at all. Marin had to hold back her tears. She knew that if her mother continued to skip meals every time, it would be unlikely she'd survive that cold winter. Trying to help her in some way, the MC suggested reading one of her favorite books that night, since her mother always said that her daughter's voice helped her fall asleep, which lifted the lady's mood a lot. In fact, when the girl read to her, her soul became lighter, and Marin was surprised she hadn't thought of this sooner. However, a knock on the door caught Marin's attention. She quickly said she was going to see who was there, leaving the soup near her mother, and once again asking her to at least try to eat in the meantime. When she opened the door, the girl found Giorno, the landlord of the two of them. The girl greeted the man with contempt in her gaze. She definitely didn't want to see that rat, but she needed to know what brought him there. The guy asked what was the point of all the formality, since they had been close for a long time, and Marin, not wanting to be near him, said that if he had nothing to say, then it would be better for her to go back inside. However, before she could close the door, the guy forced it open with his arm, and finally said that, starting that month, the rent would be tripled, and Marin couldn't understand how the guy could make such a change, so suddenly, indignant, he insisted that he had already raised the rent for everyone a long time ago, but that he had postponed it until the last minute for Marin as a favor. The problem is that the MC had nowhere to get such a large amount of money now, and she only had one option left, to ask Giorno to wait a little longer. A perverse smile appeared on the man's face, who said that if she insisted on this, he had other ways for her to pay, and he soon reached out his hand to the girl, who was clearly uncomfortable. Frightened, Marin slammed the door right in his face as soon as his fingers approached her clothes. Even with that, the man screamed with hatred, calling her a dried-up bitch and promising that if she didn't have the money before his next visit, he would throw her and her mother out on the street. The girl's head was spinning when she was completely alone in the room. She tried to hold herself together so as not to collapse right there. After all, winter was coming, and Marin couldn't allow her and her sick mother to be kicked out like that with nowhere to go. That's why she had to find a way to get that money as soon as possible. Opening one of her drawers, the girl came to the conclusion that she had no choice but to use something she had tried to avoid for a long time. She pulls out a stack of paper titled, "The Nightingale of the Western Duke Does Not Cry." Although it seemed like just another novel, there was something in it that only the MC knew. The girl had read many novels about the Northern Duke, but chose a book about the Western Duke because she wanted something new. In reality, she had reincarnated into that world and had been living there all this time. She even wondered if it wasn't ridiculous. The girl had suffered a car accident in her last life and spent almost a month in a coma. But when Marin finally woke up, she realized that the place where she now lived was the world of a novel. And she only discovered this because she recognized the Western Duke. The plot of the book The Bluebird of the Western Duke Does Not Cry is quite simple. Basically, the male protagonist, the Western Duke, had become blind and badly injured after being attacked by a monster, until he met the heroine, who was a medical prodigy and was able to cure his vision. After that, the heroes fell in love with each other, like in any fantasy novel. In this scenario, Marin was just a character who never even appeared in the novel, a simple extra and nothing more. In fact, her main task was to stay out of trouble so that the Duke could finally have his happy ending. But now she desperately needed money. Her new family was from the Schwentz house, a very wealthy Viscount's family. But after a carriage accident, her father and her only brother died, and the huge debts left by her father were revealed. Marin didn't even have time to settle into her new incarnation before her family fell apart and financial difficulties sank her completely. After selling everything they had, the only thing left was an antique vanity that her father had given her as a gift. With her family destroyed, Marin never got to debut in high society, so her title as the daughter of a Viscount was useless. Until that moment, the MC had done everything to follow life and ignore the book's plot. But she had finally reached her limit. With the skills she brought from her previous life and information that only she knew about that world, it was time for Marin to use all the weapons she had. So a short time later, the girl went to the Duke's palace. She wore her best dress, waiting for the appraiser to call her. The young man who met her couldn't help but comment on her impeccable handwriting, and the girl thanks him, still a bit awkward. That was living proof that she was indeed living in a novel. I mean, she was face to face with Olive Leon, who admitted it was rare to find a woman who could read and write. Marin tried to formulate thoughts while processing the fact that she was meeting a key character from the novel for the first time, and it was the Duke's assistant no less. When the guy asked about how the MC learned to write, she made up a story that it was at the Count's house in her previous job, saying that he noticed her interest in books and taught her everything. And these days she reread some of the books she had, since buying new ones would be too expensive. Even though her story might be convincing, our girl was still afraid of seeming too suspicious to Olive. In that world, most aristocrat daughters didn't learn to read and write. Instead, they learned to play musical instruments, or to contemplate works of art. But in her past life, Marin always had her face buried in books. She was always asking her father to teach her how to write, and used the rest of her time for her readings. The problem is that reading also reduced contact with the few young noble women she knew, but the time spent with books was precious and brought her a lot of joy. Olive pulls her out of her thoughts by saying that he was indeed looking for someone to help him, but that he was specifically looking for a male assistant. So much so that he had been told that a young man named Marion would come on someone's recommendation. For this reason, Olive was a little confused to see a girl in front of him, although she possessed many skills. Something that fell on Marin's head like a bucket of cold water. It's not like she had any choice but to lie. Otherwise, she wouldn't even have made it through the door, much less met the Duke. She even wondered if she shouldn't have dressed as a man, but the Duke would hardly fall for that trick, and would certainly notice she was just a woman, so she had no choice. And she stated that Marion was her older brother who had left for the capital to work, but she didn't want to miss such a wonderful opportunity to work in the duchy. Even so, Olive explains that there were already enough maids in the castle, and their hiring was done by the housekeeper, so he wasn't even involved in that. When she heard the words, "I think this interview is over," Marion didn't even let the boy finish, shouting that he would certainly need her. This leaves Olive surprised, and he asks if he would really need help. Without hesitation, the MC explains that the help would be needed specifically for His Grace, the Duke, and this completely changes the atmosphere between the two. Wary, Olive asks what the girl meant exactly. Anyway, Marin says that there was no one in those western lands who didn't know about the unfortunate incident that happened to the Duke. She had certainly crossed a great line because Olive frowned as he asked if she even knew what she was saying before asking her to leave. But our girl couldn't do that. That was her last chance, and Marin couldn't just leave. Suddenly, she saw a book on the coffee table and realized that, with its help, she could demonstrate her skills at that very moment. Without thinking, the girl headed toward the object, flipping through it quickly without even caring about Olive's shouts. Marin had already grabbed the book and started reading, reciting demon beasts. Where do they come from? Olive seemed enchanted, as he had never seen a girl read like that, but it wasn't an ordinary reading. It was a book about monsters, which said that many scientists had raised this question, but no one had ever found a definitive answer about the origin of monsters. The MC continues, reading that scientists were fascinated by a theory that couldn't even be proven, about how the ecology of monsters changed, adapting to the environment they were in. And most scientists didn't buy this idea. She continued reading about how the Count himself, who considered this theory the greatest absurdity of all, claimed otherwise. After reading a few paragraphs, she looked at Olive deeply, while he was still shocked in front of her, and asked if she should continue. But she didn't even wait for an answer to argue that since his lordship couldn't analyze documents, or rather when he couldn't, she could easily read aloud to him. She knew that a blind duke received many reports to be read, and that's where Marin could show her skills that she only had because she had been a voice actress in her past life. So once again she stated confidently, still holding the book, that she would be useful to the duke. Finally, Olive asked her to sit down. At least, she would have some chance of getting something, and so she does, trying to calm down. But the young man explained that even so, he didn't have enough authority to hire her. If it were just a matter of finding an assistant, he could decide himself. But reading documents to the Duke was an entirely different matter. After his words, Marin sighed heavily. She didn't know what to do anymore. Would she leave there without even meeting the Duke at least? What would she do about the rent? Or the money she needed to buy medicine for her mother? However, Olive noticed that she read very well, and he didn't fail to comment that it was the first time he had seen such a special talent. And to be honest, they had a lot of trouble reading documents to the Duke. Finally, he realized that it seemed Marin could solve this problem, which gave hope back to the protagonist's eyes. More excited, the girl squeezes the book and asks if what Olive meant was that she was hired, and he confirms. Smiling, the boy suggested that the two of them go directly to the Duke to give him the good news. They walked through the dark hallway of the palace in total silence, and Marin only noticed that the brightness only decreased as they walked. For a moment, the MC felt like she was in a totally lightless cave. Noticing the girl's suspicious looks, Olive said that his lordship is very sensitive to light. For this reason, if she really were to serve the Duke, he was ready to tell her about many things she should be careful about. Finally, they arrive at the boy's office, and Olive knocks on the door carefully. Inside, his lordship was at his desk in total silence, until he asked his servant to come in. Marin followed him without making noise, or at least trying. When she looked at that boy, her eyes lit up. She was really face to face with the main character of the novel, The Blue Bird of the Western Duke Does Not Cry. Duke Gerald wore a black band that hid his eyes, which only made him even more mysterious and attractive. When the boy asked what was happening, Olive explained that he wanted to hire a person, but as it seemed to be a matter that required his lordship's permission, he thought it was better to go personally to talk to him. This is enough to make the boy indignant. Since when did he need to get involved in every issue related to the servants? The point was that this servant was somewhat special, and Olive explains that it would be having her around to help. Gerald responded impatiently that he had already consulted all the doctors in the Empire, but the boy explained that she wasn't a doctor at all. But he was sure she could help the Duke. He just needed a moment of his time to prove it. Pulling a sheet from his reports off the desk, then Olive asked the girl to do exactly what she had done in the living room. Marin took the sheet of paper and prepared to begin reading, even with her hands trembling with anxiety at that moment. She knew she could do it without problems, but more than that, she needed to do it. Thus, the MC began to read an urgent report about a silver mine discovered in the Neron domain, surprising the Duke with that voice. The document contained information about the results of the annual survey of his men, as well as the area where underground monsters appeared in the tunnels. The young man listened attentively to her reading, and it seemed that Marin's voice filled the entire room at that moment. And the report stated that mining experts believed it would be best to close the mine and asked for urgency in resolving this. They asked for a document ordering the immediate closure of the silver mines. When she finished reading, the girl realized that this was in the original story. The silver mine is a fairly important theme in the middle of the novel, since the main character went there to collect medicinal herbs and accidentally picked up some mineral. Sometime later, she turned it into a necklace, leaving all of high society completely enchanted by that unusual stone. In the end, that mine wasn't silver, but rather precious stones never seen before. They were stones called opal, the first stone discovered with that unique brilliance. Of course, its price went through the roof right away. For some reason, the MC hadn't immediately remembered this. If she had dug a little secretly, she would have become rich in an instant. She was so lost in thought that she let slip a what a waste, making the Duke approach her to find out what she was talking about. Marin didn't even notice when he managed to get so close to her and shuddered with surprise. Gerald asked her again what the girl meant by waste. That was scary for the girl, who soon backed away. She was so flustered that she ended up tripping over her own shoes. And she was already ready to fall right in the middle of the castle owner's office, without even being hired yet. However, the Duke managed to grab her hand literally in a second, holding her quickly by the shoulders. Thanking the Duke for saving her, our girl was sweating with nervousness. She was hypnotized by that beautiful man in front of her. Of course, it was expected that the protagonist would be even more charming up close. but she also knew that this wasn't the time to be admiring his face. For some reason, he was still holding her hand and didn't seem at all ready to let go. Finally, Gerald turned to Olive and asked if he was known in the kingdom for his patience. At that moment, the heroine was so scared that she decided to appeal to the monsters, shouting in the boy's face, which took a bit of Gerald's attention, and he didn't understand why she had decided to talk about monsters at that moment. Still a bit awkward, the girl admitted to knowing that the tunnel monsters loved shiny minerals that look like precious stones, suggesting that if monsters appear frequently, then even if it's not silver, there could be other jewels there. Still holding her wrist, Gerald asked the name of that bold girl, confirming that she was indeed a commoner. Looking at her own wrist, the MC waited for him to release her hand soon, but the boy was very focused on how it was already surprising that the commoner could read. But for some reason, Marin even analyzed the reports. Pulling her hand closer, the Duke accused her of being a spy, which makes the poor girl scream, denying it desperately. That was the last thing she needed given the situation. Still, it seemed the young man was serious. There wasn't a drop of doubt on his face. He finally released Marin's hand and asked Olive to draft a temporary employment contract, at least for now. At that moment, a hopeful smile appeared on the girl's face, who thanked him immensely for the chance. She bowed before the Duke while he decided to give another order to his assistant, asking him to feed Marin, and not even Olive expected to hear that. Then Gerald explains that the MC's wrist was thin as a twig, offending the poor girl for nothing. Of course he would think that. The Duke's hands were huge. Anyone would have a childlike wrist next to him. After this unexpected meeting, the Duke was alone in his office, and for the first time in a while seemed dazed. He thought about how Marin seemed to be an interesting woman. Besides, her voice didn't irritate him at all. On the contrary, Gerald couldn't even remember the last time he had heard a report and actually thought about it, and now he understood why Olive had asked so insistently. The House of Vines, which protected the Western lands, has a family secret that was passed only to the direct heir for many generations. They had eyes that could distinguish the eye color of birds flying far away, ears that could distinguish all sounds within a 50-meter radius, a tongue and a nose that could distinguish all smells and tastes, and skin capable of feeling even the lightest touch. All the senses of its members were beyond human capabilities. And Gerald von Vines was the most attentive of all the dukes. The great House of Vines, the defenders of the Western vineyards, possessed a belief incapable of being broken. And it became even more famous because of the current duke. A year ago, a monster attack deprived the Duke of his sight. Everything turned upside down in the kingdom. And as if trying to compensate for the lost vision, his other senses became even more acute. But with this, his mind began to become increasingly exhausted. Especially his hearing. They said that even the sound of an insect crawling hit his head like thunder. The girl wouldn't leave his head. He understood perfectly well that she was afraid of him, but she managed to lie even with that. The boy could hear her racing heart. He knew she was nervous, and even so, she lied. Curious, the Duke called his assistant named Kay, ordering him to find out everything about that girl, every detail of her life, as well as her origin. Kay was as mysterious as Gerald, and took care of all the boy's secret missions. On the other side of the castle, Marin was screaming, seeing that the contract Olive made established a payment of 1 gold per week as salary. This is because 1 gold was enough for her to survive an entire month. She was finally beginning to understand why they say you should become a servant of a rich master. Olive explained that she was considered a special employee, hence the high pay. Which made sense, and the girl remembered that in the original work there were people like that who worked in such elevated positions. The spies infiltrated in the eastern lands, the Duke's shadow called Kay, a blacksmith from the ducal house called Shireen, and even an alchemist called Zero. Curious, Marin asked if in case she became a permanent employee, her salary would increase. Something Olive confirms, leaving her even more excited, while he encouraged the girl to work even harder to get the position. Without even thinking, she signed the documents, even with the boy asking her not to rush and to verify everything carefully. But the girl knew that a ducal house wouldn't scam her like that, right? That wasn't all. The boy holds out a book to the girl, saying that since she had commented she liked to read, he'd like her to keep it. The book belonged to the ducal library. Looking at the title, the MC realized that this was the same book she had already read once. Holding the object in her hands, she comments that the book seemed very valuable, and even asked again if it was really for her to keep. When Olive explains that they were going to throw it away anyway, our girl completely changed her expression, asking that they always give her the ones they were going to discard. Thanks to this book, the MC passed the interview and was now also receiving it as a gift. It was a true lucky book for her. After successfully getting the job, Marin returned to her mother, who waited for her until late at night, and the woman comments that the girl must be very tired from work, something the MC denies. Since she had been late getting home, she asked the lady to wait for her while she cleaned everything up so that she could finally read her book. But concern took over her head when she saw that her mother hadn't eaten again. Striking up conversation, Marin asks her mother to take a look at what she had brought. It was a basket full of delicious food, bread, sweets, meat, milk, everything that hadn't been in their house for a long time. The mother looked at her daughter in surprise, not understanding what all that meant and where she had gotten so much. She started to worry that her daughter had borrowed money from someone again because of her, but Marin soon denied it, and finally gave the good news. She had gotten a job at the ducal house, and the woman immediately realized that the daughter was referring to the famous Vines family. The young girl was smiling as she said that it was the same Western house of the Duke, and that as a welcome gift they had given her a basket of food. Without holding back her tears, the mother was super happy. She knew that the ducal family was trustworthy, especially when it came to the renowned Duke Vines. It had been a long time since the daughter had seen her mother smile so happily, because after the accident, the mother had even stopped praying. But there she was, thanking God endlessly for Marin's new job. However, there was a detail that she would have to tell. And she explains that she had to lie to his lordship, claiming to be a commoner, being scolded right off the bat. Embarrassed, the MC explains that if she had told the truth about her noble origins, there would have been no chance of an interview, since young girls were always trying to approach Gerald with other intentions. For this reason, before meeting the protagonist of the original story, he hadn't been with anyone. Before, she even thought it was an exaggeration by the writer, but now that she had been so close to him, it was completely understandable that he avoided women. Trying to change the subject, the girl asked her mother not to worry too much about it, especially because her plan was to resign as soon as she could save up a certain amount, and her mother didn't try to convince her otherwise. The woman believed in her little Marin, who was doing her utmost to improve their lives. And our girl knew that, when the Duke met the main character, he would see the light again and naturally would no longer need her. The last thing the protagonist wanted was to get involved in the events of the original novel or get into trouble. She just needed money to live in peace with her mother. The first thing she would do would be to buy a bigger house with a garden full of the woman's favorite flowers. She even thought she wouldn't need to become a permanent employee and was confident that she would have to endure at most about 6 months. She just didn't expect that. The next day, when arriving at the new job, the poor thing would be sent home. Olive explains somewhat awkwardly that it was better for her to leave for that day. The boy tried to be as polite as possible in his response and assured her that it would be better for the girl to go home that day and also the next day and the next. Marin didn't understand what was happening since she had just been hired the day before by the Duke himself. The young girl asks if she had been fired, but she believed this couldn't have happened. The girl throws herself on the floor, repeating that she couldn't just leave after facing so many difficulties to get there, and questioned how she could be expelled after just one day, swearing she could even die there if she needed to. Olive tried to calm her down and assured her that wasn't the problem. While she was trying to understand the situation, the Duke opened his door, calling the two of them in. She didn't even know that his lordship was in there and mentally hated herself for making so much noise right in front of his office. The Duke remained serious as always, but was holding a bloody cloth on top of his desk. The girl widened her eyes immediately. She knew that smell well. It was definitely blood, which made her immediately remember the carriage incident that would forever remain in her memory. She heard the neighing of horses and remembered the drops of blood falling before her eyes, but the girl made an effort to compose herself and not be shaken in front of her new boss. The two men stared at her deeply while our MC tried at all costs not to collapse right there. But a strange question hit her hard. Why are you so desperate to die? Gerald asks if she had really said she wanted to die in that palace. Embarrassed, Marin explains that she didn't have that intention, and Olive even asked the boss for forgiveness for the girl's words. The assistant explained that he couldn't tell her about the Duke's condition and that he just tried to dismiss her carefully, but the lady thought she was being fired, and that's why she made all that fuss. Once again, the servant apologizes. Marin also apologizes, even though she didn't know any of that. Gerald remained quiet, just analyzing the situation. Then he turns to the servant, saying that the girl could start work that day if she was really ready. Being questioned by Olive, who was worried about the master's health, hearing his words, Marin concluded that the smell of blood was due to the fact that his lordship was injured, and Gerald ordered the boy not to insist and just deliver the report so they could leave. The servant obediently handed the important papers to the girl and indicated where she should begin reading. Alone with the Duke, Marin prepared to begin even with a trembling voice because her whole body was shaking with fear. But Gerald asked if she really intended to read the report standing by the entrance, to which she responds that she really felt more comfortable there. Of course she wasn't going to say it, but the idea of being closer to his lordship was too much for her nerves. But he seemed not to give importance to the MC's words, and in the next second was already approaching, startling the girl with his approach all of a sudden. Holding her hand like the day before, the boy could even feel Marin's breathing at this point. The truth is that Gerald wanted her to get even closer, but just that request made her heart beat even faster. The more the boy approached, the more the MC moved away, until she pulled away completely, giving a scream in the poor guy's face. Marin knew she shouldn't have made any noise, but she couldn't contain so much nervousness. The Duke called her calmly, and Marin asked him to say what he wanted, even though she couldn't even stand up straight. Then he asked directly why she had tried to hold back her noises on purpose. Even though completely caught off guard, the girl had to admit that she contained the scream because she knew a loud voice would be incredibly irritating for her boss to hear. He asked if screaming in fear wasn't a natural reaction, and she agreed that it certainly was, but her voice was still trembling. She knew she couldn't make any more mistakes, so she carefully explained that the Duke had vision problems. So she supposed that the boy must be very sensitive to sounds, and for this reason she apologized. She tried at all costs not to look at Gerald while he continued trying to decipher who that girl in front of him was. Of course, he thought it was impossible for any maid to know the secrets of the Vines family, but he had reached that conclusion too quickly. Trying to end the subject, he comments that it was a good analysis, making Marin a little less tense. That's when the light from outside invaded the room through a crack opened by the curtain, making the girl find it strange since everything there usually stayed closed. Then Gerald's silhouette shone like never before. It was incredible how he became even more handsome in the light. However, when Marin managed to look properly, she noticed something strange on the boy's ear. They were bloodstains which couldn't be confused with anything, and they were clearly visible through the black mask. Marin was a little scared, but she gathered courage and decided to ask what was happening with him. The girl stuttered as she said that there was blood coming out of his ear, and wondered if that's where the Duke was injured. But if the smell of blood was so strong, how serious could the injury be? But the boy just answered that it was nothing. Still, our girl insisted that the wound needed to be treated quickly, but the guy explained that it would heal in a day, but the way he said it made the girl even more curious. What did he mean by that? She remembered Olive's words about the Duke not treating his wounds as if they were nothing, and reinforced that he had to find out the reason for the bleeding. Looking at it like that, the two were very alike, but Gerald insisted that he already knew the reason for the blood, so the matter didn't matter to him, and this surprises Maureen a bit. Finally, he revealed to his new employee that they had pierced his ear, which is enough to throw the girl off her axis, making her question who could have done that, hoping the Duke would be sincere. Luckily, or unluckily for her, he was, and admitted that he himself was the one who committed this atrocity. How could Gerald have pierced his own ear? Could he have done this because the sounds he heard were too unbearable? She even thought that, if even a small knife cut on the finger already hurts, how unbearable must the situation have been for him to reach this point? During all that time, the heroine had been deeply mistaken. In the end, Duke Gerald, like her mother, wasn't just a novel character. In fact, he was a living person, capable of feeling pain, but for some reason, she had treated his suffering as if it were nothing. Now, Maureen even felt ashamed for having treated his pain as if it were just information from any novel, and she thought how terrifying and dark it must have been for the Duke when he lost his sight and stopped being the same person as before. The silence between the two was broken when Gerald questioned why. Tears appeared in Maureen's eyes, who tried not to show her feelings. But the Duke had very acute senses, so he asked why she was crying after hearing the information about the wound. Before she could think of an answer, Olive entered the office holding important reports and quickly greeted the two. He explained that those new documents needed urgent verification and asked Maureen to take charge of the important papers as well as the other reports, something the girl readily accepts. She had been saved by the bell. She knew that her job there was the most important, so she was ready to dive into reports and more reports. With a soft voice, she read the entire document, highlighting the most relevant details like the great voice actress she had been in her past life. When the reading of the report finally ended, the girl was already saying goodbye, stating that she would return when the next one came up, and wishing his lordship a good rest. But at the moment she prepared to leave, Gerald grabbed her fragile wrist again, preventing her from leaving the office. The first thing that came out of his mouth was a comment about the poor girl's wrist looking like a twig, which left her somewhat uncomfortable. Stressed, she states that comparing a person's wrist to a branch was an exaggeration, but he ordered her to gain more weight from then on. And he also added that after she managed to gain a few pounds, she should look for him for a checkup. The Duke's words sounded very strange, and the heroine still couldn't believe he was forcing her to eat to gain weight, but she just accepted. She just needed to get out of there fast. Without understanding the reason for such a request, Maureen prepared to leave the office, wondering if the other assistants also had to do these weird checkups. As soon as the door closed, leaving Gerald alone with his thoughts, the boy concluded, again, that that woman was very peculiar. I mean, he was sure she feared him, but at the same time, she had cried because of his wound. Without hiding her sincerity, Kay had already prepared an investigation, and according to it, the real identity of Lady Maureen Schwenz was that of the daughter of a viscount. And now, he knew that, after the death of the head of the family and the eldest son in a carriage accident, she was ruined. She lived in a tumble-down cabin, taking care of her sick mother, and had no husband or suitor. Apparently, she was just a woman with no secrets or anything special, but who, for some reason, wasn't afraid to get close to him. The Duke already considered the MC someone unpredictable, and this was too dangerous for anyone. While she walked through the corridors, still thinking about what the Duke had said about her arms, the boy smiled to himself in his room. He knew he was entering a dangerous game, but he was too interested to leave. Sometime later, Olive led the girl to her new office, which was incredibly spacious and elegant, and explained that besides the time of the report to the Duke, she would need to help him with the work there, and would even have her own desk. The desk was very fancy, and just the thought of using new furniture after so long made Maureen's heart race. She stared at the desk with unusual joy. Taking advantage that the two were alone, she decided to ask if there would be no problem in leaving Gerald's wound as it was. But Olive confessed that he had also been worried about that for a long time. He said he wished the Duke would receive treatment, but that his lordship really didn't like anything touching his body. Still, the MC warned that the wound could become inflamed, something the boy agrees with, even commenting that he slept poorly and that recovery would be even slower because of it. The girl had no idea he couldn't sleep peacefully. There was nothing in the novel about the Duke's sleep disorders that she could remember, and the girl thought maybe it was because of the increased intensity of his other senses after the loss of his vision. So, if he used something to improve, his vision could return and everything would change in his life. But she banished her thoughts because she knew it was the main character's duty to help the protagonist recover his vision and that she shouldn't interfere with that. However, she suggested to Olive that he serve a little hot wine to the boy, explaining that her mother always drank that when she couldn't sleep. Olive questioned the suggestion, having never heard that a hot alcoholic beverage could really help to relax and sleep peacefully. Taking advantage of the mood, Marin reminded Olive that she was a commoner, so he could speak to her without much formality, to which he responds in agreement, suggesting she call him by his first name. With the subject finished, Olive brought an incredibly large stack of papers, and with a lot of excitement for a worker, said it was time to start working. Marin thought she would have to leave the idea of having a good boss for later, because she had never seen a stack of bureaucracy that size. She worked non-stop until late at night, until her hands went numb from so much writing and her head stopped thinking. The girl only came out of her trance when Olive offered her some very pretty sweets, commenting that she was probably hungry after working so much. He even warned that if she didn't have enough food, she could ask him to bring more, but the girl quickly denied it. There was even too much there, but the boy countered, saying that Gerald had ordered her to gain weight, so it was for the girl to try to eat as much as possible. Even agreeing, the MC even thought that if she ate all that at once, she would definitely get sick. But on the first bite, her eyes shone. That was delicious. She couldn't help but think of her mother, and then asked Olive to take some cake home, apologizing for asking again because he had already shared food with her. But this wasn't a problem, and Olive agreed and warned that he would certainly tell the kitchen to pack a treat for her to take home. The sound of a male cough invaded the office. It was the butler, whom the girl didn't yet know, and Olive asked him to come in. His name was Sebas, a serious man the size of a wardrobe. Or at least that's what he looked like, because his face soon lit up with a friendly smile. The butler's grandson had recently gotten married, and Olive asked if everything had gone well at the ceremony, to which he responds that yes, it just went by very quickly. In the story, the gentleman was a fervent admirer of the Duke. He was even the commander of Gerald's knights. When they asked why he had gone there, Sebas explained that he wanted to know if he could personally express his gratitude to His Grace, the Duke. However, Olive admitted that this was unlikely to happen that day, breaking the boy's expectations. The girl watched everything in silence. Apparently, Olive had a lot of authority, since the servants had to ask permission to see the Duke directly from him. That's when the servant realized he hadn't yet introduced the MC, saying that she was his assistant, Marin. And he also explained that the girl had become a special employee who reported to the Duke directly, and finally introduced the butler to her. Sebas smiled, happy to meet the girl, and asked her to call him Steward Sebas. With the two introduced, the servant didn't hide the fact that Marin's reporting skills were so excellent that even the Duke was satisfied, which left Sebas incredibly surprised. An awkward smile appeared on the heroine's face. It wasn't every day that they heard her boss loved listening while she read endless reports. The butler suddenly grabbed the protagonist's hand and stated that if even the Duke liked her, she must be someone really impressive, adding that if the girl needed anything in the future, she could always count on him. The girl thanks him still a bit awkwardly. After all, that gentleman was full of energy. But she knew more than ever that she needed to be careful so that her lie wouldn't be discovered, because if the Duke's admirers found out the truth, she would be done for good. When night finally fell over the castle, Gerald remained pensive in his office, until someone opened the door calling him. It was Olive, who had gone there to check on the master's state, and was surprised to see him awake. For this reason, he insisted that he needed to sleep that day, since several days had passed without rest, which could affect his health. Following Marin's advice, he brought hot wine. Of course, Gerald immediately sensed the aroma of the drink and asked if the servant really thought that would help him fall asleep. The boy didn't hide that he had decided to bring the hot wine on Marin's recommendation, which left the Duke a little surprised. After all, she was just a temporary employee. But while serving the drink, Olive explained that the MC told him that her mother drank wine when she couldn't sleep. When the boy questioned where she was, the servant said the girl had left the workplace a long time ago, since it was late. The Duke still hadn't even drunk, just held the glass suspiciously. Taking advantage that the two were alone, Olive commented that regarding Miss Marin, the fact that she could read and that her mother drank wine was somewhat strange. Even the way she held the teacup denounced her noble origin, and the assistant noted that she didn't seem to be a commoner at all. Since the Duke had already discovered that the girl was the daughter of a bankrupt viscount, he decided to share with Olive, who soon suggested that maybe her goal was just money and that her situation must be truly desperate, since she even falsified her resume. But who knows? She was a woman everyone liked without effort. That's exactly why Gerald was haunted by the thought that she possessed genuine spy abilities. Taking a small sip of the hot wine, the boy felt relaxed. He hadn't drunk in a long time and commented that it wasn't so bad. Meanwhile, Marin smiled satisfied as she carried the basket full of food home. She felt very grateful to the cooks for putting in so much effort and was happy to have talked with Olive about the matter. Not only that, but the MC had already noticed that her mother had been recovering her appetite lately, which was another reason for the girl to feed herself nutritious foods. She was already arriving home, lost in thoughts about how she would have to work more to make more money when something caught her attention. For some reason, the front door was wide open. Marin felt such despair that she dropped that basket on the ground immediately. She runs into the cabin to see if her mother was okay, but found everything turned upside down. She had no idea what had happened, but something terrible was certainly coming. Finally, she heard her mother's voice coming from her room, desperately calling her daughter for help. Marin's heart was pounding in her chest as the MC ran desperately to her mother's room. She asked at the top of her lungs if the woman was okay, until she found her sitting on the floor with disheveled hair clinging to the dresser. With a trembling voice, the mother told that the landlord's wife had gone there because she confused Marin with her husband's mistress. So she started breaking everything and accusing her of a bunch of things, plus warning that if she didn't receive the rent by the next day, they should leave. The mother apologized to Marin, but the daughter tried to calm her, making it clear that she wasn't to blame for anything. Unfortunately, the woman hadn't managed to save anything besides the vanity, which served as a memento of MC's late father. But Marin knew that the woman wasn't to blame for anything that had happened there, and made that very clear. In fact, she was sure that everything was her fault. She felt that she could have acted earlier, and that she should have dealt with the landlord's advances in another way, instead of just ignoring them. The girl had only one option left. She was working at the Duke's house and could find help there, so she announced that she would go to the palace to resolve the situation. It was already late at night when Marin appeared at the gate of the Duke's mansion, worried about whether anyone would let her in. The guards approached immediately, asking who she was. The girl identified herself and said she worked for Mr. Olive and needed to see him urgently. One of the knights was surprised to learn that the girl worked for the master's assistant, since this was the first time they had seen her. For this reason, he asked his partner Ubis if he knew that woman who claimed to work for Olive himself. The young man looked at the girl carefully, trying to see if he recognized her. But he really had no idea who Marin was. They started chatting among themselves to find out if they at least knew who Olive was, but Ubis had no idea what the servant looked like. Basically, they didn't know anything around there. Out of nowhere, the redhead ran from the conversation, having to hear his friend shouting for him to come back. Embarrassed, the boy apologizes to the MC, explaining that his companion was still very young, and decided that he himself would check everything before giving an answer about her entry. When she finally got in, our girl had to wait anxiously in the living room. Fortunately, the butler confirmed her identity and asked immediately if she wanted to meet with Olive, which left the girl relieved. Surprised by the unexpected appearance, Olive went to the girl to ask if something urgent had happened for her to be there at that hour. The girl greets him formally, but goes straight to the point, explaining that she knew she had only worked there for one day, but she needed an advance of 1 week of her pay. Desperate, she confessed that her landlord had warned her that if she didn't pay the rent by the next day, she would have to move immediately, adding that her mother was sick and couldn't live in such instability. She was about to cry in front of Olive, but the young man asked the girl to calm down and lift her head. Because, personally, he was willing to help her at that moment, but emphasized that the decision about the salary was exclusively the Duke's. Therefore, he suggested first reporting what happened to Gerald so that he would be aware of everything. Standing outside the office, Olive calls for the master, explaining that he had something about Marin that was urgent. As always, Gerald asked them to come in, because he always sensed when something was very important. But for some reason, Olive asked her to hold the candle, leaving the MC confused, because he always entered the office first. The thing is, this time, the Duke called only her, which meant that the boy didn't have permission to accompany her. Marin had never heard anyone pronounce her name like that, and it was the first time the Duke decided to talk to her personally, without the presence of an assistant. Awkwardly, the girl followed and entered the office apologizing for bothering the boy in the middle of the night, and the boy went straight to ask what had happened. The girl felt super embarrassed, apologizing for causing problems for her new boss before asking if she could receive her salary advanced by 1 week. Gerald remained silent for a moment, without responding, as if he were evaluating the situation to understand if he had heard correctly, until the boy questioned why he should grant this request, since he would have no guarantee she would continue there. She had no way of giving him anything in return, that was the truth. And it was precisely this that threw the girl off her axis for good. Marin's eyes widened, and she wonders what to say. After all, what could someone like her without a penny in her pocket do for the Duke? Luckily, her gaze fell on the glass of red wine, and she had a thought. She had remembered that she was the one who recommended this method to Olive. Therefore, without hesitation, the girl declared that she would put the boy to sleep and that this would be the best help for him. Explaining that she not only understood reports well but also read books perfectly, even mentioning that her mother said that when she read aloud she fell asleep much better. The Duke asked surprised how the MC knew he couldn't sleep and if perhaps his assistant had really let everything slip. Trying to protect the poor guy, the girl confirms, but makes it clear that Olive said it without any bad intention because he was really worried about him. Surprisingly, the Duke agreed with her proposal, and she even had to ask him to repeat it to be sure of what she heard. The boy repeats, saying that the two of them could go to sleep at that very moment. Now Marine only needed to perform the most important task, which was to put the Duke to sleep so she could help her mother once and for all. That phrase of his left our girl bewildered. Of course she hadn't said anything wrong, but it sounded very strange. In my opinion, I think she was pretty excited to sleep with him. The boy asked how long it took from the castle to her house, to which she answered that the trip to the cabin took about an hour. It was a long distance, so Gerald warned that she would have to move, calling Olive, who entered the office somewhat awkwardly, and asked that the temporary housing be transferred to the annex on the morning of the next day, and that, since the girl had family, everything be organized so they could live together. This meant that Marin could now live in the ducal castle with her mother, which left her euphoric inside. In addition, the master ordered that the advance be paid right at that moment, which made the MC marveled because she had not only resolved the money, but also her permanent housing. Emotional, the girl calls his lordship, and thanks him immensely for the help. Her eyes were brighter than ever. With this resolved, Olive invited the girl to return to the office to discuss the details and particularities of the move, leaving Gerald alone again with his thoughts. Reading books to fall asleep, that's all he needed. Now Marin would play the role of a nanny. The boy was intrigued about what was going on in her little head, but he knew that since the girl would now live in his castle, he would soon be able to discover all her secrets. Olive provided the girl with the best horse available that night, and Marin even thanked the animal with caresses while calling her a good girl. The mother came out to meet her daughter with slow, worried steps. She asks how the trip to the castle was and whose horse that was, but the MC was more worried about her mother catching a chill and explained that since it was late, the people there offered the horse for her to return safely. But this didn't matter. Marin had good news, declaring that she and her mother were going to move, but she couldn't finish the sentence because the woman was already desperate, since she was sure they had nowhere to go and wanted to figure something out on her own. But the girl interrupted her, holding her carefully before saying that the Duke gave them an annex for servants so they could live there together, adding that the very next day they would send a carriage so the mother could travel comfortably and also transport all her things. The lady could hardly believe it. She was incredibly grateful to Duke Vines, who revealed himself to be a true protector of all the people of the West by helping Marin without thinking twice. The daughter hadn't seen her mother smile happily in a long time, and the lady couldn't even imagine how to repay such a favor. Our girl was very relieved because she never thought the day would come when they would finally leave that terrible cabin, but it had finally arrived. The next morning, the birds sang happily, but suddenly they were scared away by someone yelling for another person to hurry up. It was the landlord of Marin and her mother's cabin, hearing screams and more screams from his wife saying that at this rate she would never collect all the money she needed. Tired, the man insisted that his wife knew their situation perfectly and questioned how they would get that money in just one day, to which she responded indignantly that she wasn't going to fetch the money, but rather pull out that girl's hair, because doing it just to her mother's wouldn't be enough to satisfy her. Even so, Giorno insists that no one would want to live in a hole like that, and that, if they left, they would hardly find new tenants for that ruined cabin. This provokes deep hatred in the woman, who screams asking who he thought she was doing this for, stating that this was because of the affair he had with Marin, even though he said otherwise. The wife still thought Giorno was trying to defend Marin even after everything, despite him denying it several times, until he found a perfect opportunity to escape. When he saw that Marin was standing in front of the house, the guy shouted for his wife to see. It was no coincidence that Marin was waiting for them. And this puts a perverse smile on the woman's face, who says that the girl looked ready to have her hair pulled out at that moment. The landlord and his wife approached the girl, who really looked like a fragile twig compared to the two of them. Giorno's wife was sure the girl had already prepared all the money, but for some reason Marin didn't seem at all friendly. She throws on the ground a black bag with silver coins, which should certainly be enough to pay the rent. The man couldn't believe that she had managed such a large amount, and his wife was sure that there was only one way to get all of that in just one night, stating that it was obvious that the girl had used her own body to make this money, but Marin wasn't going to take anything silently. Then the girl slapped that stupid woman with all her strength, right on the face, releasing all her anger. The lady certainly didn't expect to be hit by a brat like the MC, and was indignant, asking if that girl had gone completely crazy. But this didn't matter. What Marin wanted to know was how the woman dared to raise her hand against her own mother, who had been sick for a long time. That seemed to be news to Giorno too, who questioned what she was talking about. Now it was finally Marin's turn to deal with that useless man, hitting him in the face with all her strength. Before he could even react, the girl made it clear that he had always been the problem there, and the MC asked if he really thought she wouldn't find out who Giorno was cheating on his wife with. And the mention of the name Wendy was enough for the boy to widen his eyes. He had been caught. The wife looked furiously at her husband, saying she didn't understand what that name had to do with the situation, because Wendy herself had said he was cheating on her with Marin. Even being caught, the boy tried to deny his affair at all costs. Totally enraged, the woman grabs him by the hair upon learning of her husband's infidelity, who had just called the mistress beautiful and perfect right in front of her. Of course, the landlord's hatred fell on Marin, since it was only thanks to her that his wife was able to discover the name of his real mistress. While the wife pulled his hair and continued to shout, Giorno tried to advance on the girl who had been the cause of all that, but his hand was abruptly stopped by a third person who soon asked what was happening. It was Sebas, who was fully aware that this didn't look like a simple marital fight at all. The mayor and his wife were shocked, realizing that the man in front of them wasn't a common person. Sebas sighs, tired of all that confusion. He greets Marin formally with a smile on his face. And a super luxurious carriage, white as snow and with golden details, approached. Finally, the butler announced that he had come personally to pick up the girl and her mother. Leaving Marin surprised, because when they had said they would send a carriage, she didn't imagine that Sebas himself would arrive in person, even more so early in the morning. That carriage was very fancy, and the commoners were hypnotized by the whole scene. Sebas had arrived at the right time, as if he knew that the MC would need help. The mayor's wife and her husband looked at the boy with fear, not understanding what was happening. Sebas faced the two seriously and declared that he had arrived at the perfect moment to discover the truth. A bold smile appeared on the face of that unbearable woman, and she stated that now she understood where all the money came from. She was sure the girl had hooked a rich old man and that this was the only way she could pay what she owed. The butler wasn't joking with those two. So he stated that this property belonged to the Duke of Vines, just as the mountain was also part of the Duke's house lands, leaving the woman confused about why he was talking about this subject out of nowhere. Super stern, he asked the boy if he had received permission from the Duke when he built that cabin to then rent it out for so long. Nervous, Giorno admitted that the Duke had said a cabin could be built for the rest of hunters. That is, he only allowed free use of the space but said nothing about charging rent. His wife began to scream, questioning how that man dared to say anything or threaten them using the Duke's name, because none of them expected the official butler of the House of the Duke of Vines to be right there in front of them. And in a snap of fingers, he surrounded the couple of swindlers and asked his assistants to take those bold people who thought they were too important away. This makes the landlord's wife throw herself at his feet, confessing guilt while she begged for forgiveness, and even promising to apologize to Marin. Now that she was the one at a disadvantage and needed to save her house, she acted this way, but Marin, with a firm look, didn't want to help someone who raised a hand to her mother. She wanted the woman to pay everything. Even so, the landlord's wife screamed, begging for mercy, but it was too late. With this resolved, the butler asked Marin since when she knew the rent couldn't be charged in those parts, and the young girl reveals that she had known everything from the beginning, but during all this time she had paid the rent properly just to ensure a roof over her head, explaining that it was impossible to find a cheaper place than that, so she didn't want to complain or denounce. But everything changed when they hit her mother, that she would never endure silently. She couldn't forgive them for having touched her mother, and it was even satisfying to see the boy and his wife being taken away by the Duke's assistants. With this resolved, the girl thought it was good form to introduce her mother and Sebas formally. Soon the woman came out to greet the butler and made a polite curtsy, introducing herself as Roanna. He was surprised by the way she bowed, thinking that the assistant was probably right. Those women didn't seem at all like common people. Sebas imagined that this meant the Duke knew about Marin's lie, but he still kept her around for some reason he hoped to discover soon. The only thing left for them was an antique vanity, which was already being taken away by the Duke's assistants. Finally, Marin asked her mother to enter the carriage, while she herself decided to go on the horse she had taken the night before, promising to be careful. The butler had already heard about the horse from the assistant, and Marin asked him to take care of her mother during the trip. Marin was sure the butler would take good care of Roanna, and watched the two leave with a smile on her face. Now she was sure she would never go back to that place. She and her mother would have a much better life. Olive welcomed them with a radiant smile, showing Marin the new room and asking if she had liked it. According to him, that was the room that received the best sunlight, a special room that the Duke had reserved for Marin and her mother. Roanna could hardly believe that this was a servant's room, and the MC had to agree that it didn't look like one at all. Olive explained that the entire third floor of the annex had been freed especially for them, so if they didn't like that room they could choose any other. But for Roanna it was impossible not to like it there, and she made it clear that if she could, she would gladly live there. Marin suggested staying in the room next to her mother's, and the two were so happy they could hardly believe it was true. Their conversation is interrupted when the door opens, and a red-haired maid named Yuria came in, explaining that she had been chosen as the personal servant of the two starting that day. Marin was surprised because they had even provided a private maid, plus that red hair of the girl seemed very familiar to her. They greeted Yuria, and Marin politely introduced her mother. Smiling, the maid admitted being very happy to help her new mistress and her mother as well. But the MC asked her not to use the word lady, because she wanted them to talk like good friends. Yuria smiled, stating she would do her best, but ended up calling her Miss Marin by mistake, correcting herself immediately and admitting that the formal way of speaking simply wouldn't leave her tongue, but promising to make up for it with a delicious meal soon. Yuria was a darling person, and Marin asked her to call her whatever way she thought best, without frills or difficult words. After putting everything on the table, the maid warned that as soon as they finished, she just had to leave the dishes on the table, and she would come to clean them quickly. Besides, if the girl needed anything, she just had to ring the bell next to the table at any time, and she would come running. With that, Olive also took his leave. As soon as mother and daughter sat down at the luxurious table, the smile didn't leave their faces. Everything looked very tasty. However, suddenly, Roanna got a worried look, and her daughter soon noticed. She asked what had happened, and really, there was something that still bothered her a lot about this new life. The mother confessed that she had been so charmed by the kind way the Duke was treating them that she completely forgot about the type of person he really was, and she was afraid that if they discovered they had lied, a terrible problem would happen. Our girl knew that Roanna was right. The day her lie came to light, they would be in the same situation as Giorno and Oxanda. All that kindness would end in the blink of an eye, and at any moment, Marin could become useless as an assistant and end up on the street again. Even so, the girl asked her mother not to worry, and promised to do everything to be useful to the Duke. Speaking of him, the boy was hearing about how the girl had taken on the landlord and his wife, which makes Gerald give a small smile, leaving his servants completely shocked. They couldn't even remember the last time they saw the master laugh. However, returning to his pose, the Duke gave the order that the properties be taken, that they be condemned to 5 years of forced labor, and that they make a complete investigation so that everyone received the same treatment. And since the woman who had hit Marin's mother didn't know she was a noblewoman, the Duke ordered that she be prevented from using her hands forever. Thus, the two servants withdrew from the office, leaving the boy alone again. It seemed that every time he managed to relax a little, his senses exploded over something. His head seemed about to burst, and even his own sounds became an arrow that exploded in his ears. Even when he bit his lips to contain the moans, the taste of blood already made him sick. Lost in thought, the Duke realized he couldn't even remember the last time he had slept. He even wondered if it made sense to endure all that. Honestly, maybe it would be better to just die. It would certainly be easier. However, Marin's words came to his mind like a light. The girl had promised to help him fall asleep. Still, Gerald didn't know if she could really do that, since it was something no one had been able to do before. And even if she could, considering that terrible pain seemed to be bursting his head, he needed the girl to do it before he went mad. That day, Marin entered a luxurious library for the first time and had no idea so many books existed in one place. She was so enchanted she didn't contain her joy and exclaimed that it was incredible. The library was huge and fancy, as expected from the Vine's house, and her heart raced with the smell of old paper and leather she hadn't smelled in a long time. But it wasn't time to lose focus. She needed to choose a book to read to the Duke quickly. Just thinking that if she helped him sleep, she would earn a whole gold coin was already exciting. This was fantastic, because she could save a lot of money in just 1 week. The library had everything from philosophy, history, and even a book on herbs that caught Marin's attention. In the original story, the main character cured the Duke's eyes by preparing a remedy with a special herb. The original book only mentioned the name, without giving details or explanations, so she wondered what exactly that magical herb would be. Curious, the MC decided to try to find that plant. While she looked at the index, she searched for the name Manjul Song, and didn't even notice she said it out loud. She was so distracted in the search that she didn't notice someone entering, and heard a voice ask why she was looking for that specific herb. When she turned around, she saw a new character in front of her, and understood right away who it was. Marin looked surprised at the little boy who approached her and asked what she was doing there. With eyes blue as the sky, hair white as snow, and a book in his hands, that boy was incredibly cute. The girl introduced herself somewhat awkwardly, and the child admitted he had already heard about her because of Olive. The little boy's name was Zero, and he politely held out his hand to greet her, and Marin soon caught on to who he was. In the future, he would be a genius of alchemy, and a great friend of the Duke who was the same age as the boy. So Marin didn't understand where that angelic appearance came from, which made anyone feel affection for him. Apparently, what they said about him having drunk a potion to transform someone into a child was true. Even with this small detail, Zero was still very cute. Friendly, the girl shook the boy's hand and said she was very happy to meet Mr. Zero. He touched her fingers gently and kissed her hand like a true nobleman. Marin felt a bit awkward with the gesture, since his behavior didn't seem at all like that of a common child. Zero noticed that Lady Marin seemed to be a person quite out of the ordinary, and she was surprised to hear this from a little boy. He comments that the girl was talking to him very formally, even though he was a child, and Marin just answered that, since she was a commoner, it was natural to speak with respect. But the boy laughed, saying that she had no skill at lying, and this left him very excited. Marin tried to prove she really was a commoner and that she wasn't fooling anyone, but the little boy seemed to already know very well who she was. Even so, he wanted to know why she was looking for the herb called Mandelson, since it would be strange for a common girl to be interested in this subject. Hearing this, Marin asked why he thought that herb was something common, because she knew that a magic potion was made from it. Then, Zero explained that this plant grew anywhere, even on the side of the road, and in the garden of the Duke's castle, and that it could hardly be considered medicinal. That was the reason he hadn't put the plant in the book. And at that moment, Marin realized that the boy knew the work very well. In fact, he was the author himself, Mr. Zero, an amazing boy with blue eyes. The little boy even showed that his autograph was in the book, and Marin could hardly believe it. So impressive it was. Her admiration leaves Zero mega proud. He was indeed confident about what he knew, and was happy she had liked his book. However, the girl soon tried to organize her thoughts, realizing that on the inside, that boy was an adult, and she couldn't forget that. So she decided to take advantage to find out everything about Mandelson, with the only person who understood the subject. He was holding another book, bound in red velvet, and agreed to answer all her questions. Finally, Zero opened to the right page, and there was the illustration of the plant. It was just like the dandelions from Marin's past life, with dark leaves and a yellow flower at the tip. Curious, Marin asked if it really worked as a remedy, but the boy was sure the plant had no special properties, besides a refreshing smell that resembled mint. It seemed that no one, besides the main character of the original story, knew the true powers of that plant, which left the MC a little upset. Zero also added that the flower wasn't medicinal, but rather poisonous, and he was completely right. Because that yellow flower had toxic substances that caused stomach pain, it seemed impossible that it would be useful for anything. For this reason, he had included the plant in a special book he had recently written. That caught Marin by surprise. After all, this current situation was completely different from the original story. She started thinking about the matter, and didn't understand how a medicinal plant could be on the kingdom's poison list. Sometime later, the girl and Zero parted ways, but even at a distance, she didn't stop thinking about the plant, trying to figure out where the secret was. This was because in the original novel, the Duke had drunk Mandelson juice, and that had cured his eyes immediately. His total cure was the role of the protagonist of the novel, but now Marin wanted to do something. It didn't have to be much. She just wanted to alleviate the Duke's suffering a little before the meeting of the two, using a very small dose. The problem was that using poison against Gerald was much more serious than just telling a lie. Apparently, only the main character would be able to remove the poison from the plant and create the remedy that would restore Gerald's vision. She needed to remember that she had decided from the beginning not to meddle in the lives of the main characters. She was only at that job out of necessity, and nothing more. Even so, she felt bad about the fact that Gerald suffered every day with a horrible pain that wouldn't let anyone have a normal life. Marin had already learned everything about his suffering by reading the novel, but she had to pretend she didn't know anything. But even though she wouldn't help him directly, she knew everything would be fine. All she had to do was wait a little longer until the main character appeared. It would be that other person who would save the protagonist, since only she had the power to do so. That night, the girl entered her boss's office and asked if they could postpone the wrist exam, because she felt she still wasn't ready. The Duke looked at her with interest and said that she herself had promised to improve a few days ago, and then he held out his hand and asked her to come closer. Of course, our girl had no way to refuse. His gesture was even like that of someone calling a little dog in training to give its paw, but Marin wasn't a trained dog, and Gerald just wanted to check her wrist, which should be improving. He even asked with a smile if the MC wanted to be his pet, while Marin continued to deny it nervously. The Duke found this funny and commented that the girl's wrist was still as fragile as a twig. Irritated, our girl pulled her hand back quickly, warning that she wasn't ready yet, but that she would soon gain weight. Then she prepared to read the book she had brought, and asked him to forget about her wrist and pay attention to her voice. She had brought fairy tales on purpose, thinking this would help the boy fall asleep quickly, since it was the best type of book to make anyone fall asleep fast. Dryly, Gerald explained that the more boring the book, the better the dream, and he was happy she had chosen fairy tales and not a silly story with a happy ending. Upon opening the first page, the girl prepared to begin reading and asked the Duke to take a deep breath and relax, or at least try. The tale was about a noble crow that had lived a long time ago, and she read each word with a soft voice. Marin told that one day while the crow was settling in its nest, a snake began watching it very closely. At that moment, Gerald closed his eyes, concentrating on that calm voice that gave him chills, even though it was the only one capable of truly calming him. The Duke had never heard anything like it. Her voice was so good, he felt his body tremble. It seemed he was in another world at that moment, but his consciousness remained there in the darkness of the office, listening to her whisper. Strange questions arose in his head. Why had the girl apologized to him before, and what exactly had she done to apologize for hiding who she was? He felt his senses fail and could no longer think, so he ordered the girl to stop reading, startling her so much that the poor girl almost dropped the book. Gerald grabbed her by the shoulders quickly, as he loved to do apparently. He pressed his face against her neck so quickly that she didn't understand anything. To the boy, it was clear that woman had done something to him and completely messed with his head. When Marin realized that the Duke was too close, she gave a startled scream in the Duke's ear, who was too busy questioning if she hadn't used poison against him, because it wouldn't be so easy to fall asleep like that. He leaned against the MC's neck, smelling clean grass, sun, and something he was feeling for the first time, the sweet aroma of her skin. The Duke pulled away, admitting his mistake, but his behavior was so strange that not even Marin could believe it. Determined to understand why he was acting this way, she asked the truth and discovered that he had really dozed off because of her. The Duke confidently stated that she had managed to make him sleep just by reading the book, without any poison, something he hadn't felt in a long time. That was music to Marin's ears, who was very happy to have helped the master rest, even if only for an instant. But Gerald didn't want to continue reading, using the excuse that the book wasn't that interesting, which makes the girl suggest going to the library to switch the work. She was sure he would accept, after all, who knows how much time he had spent without sleeping before that, but he refused to rest more. In fact, the boy had a deep fear of falling into too deep a sleep and never waking up again. Marin understood his concern and suggested continuing the next day, which left the Duke a bit confused. The next day, while she signed the endless documents, Olive asked if it was very difficult to help the boss sleep. Since no one had ever managed to do that before, he asked the MC not to pressure herself so much to be the first. Marin admitted it wasn't easy, and told that Gerald even dozed off a bit, but then didn't want to anymore, and Olive didn't believe it at first. He jumped with joy, squeezed the girl's hand and said that was incredible, because only the girl had made him doze off, even if for a short time. She had done what no one else had managed, and Olive said she was an amazing girl for that. The servant was even ready to give a gold coin, but Marin didn't want to accept, since the Duke didn't sleep the full sleep she wanted. Still, holding the coin, Olive guaranteed that she deserved this payment, and that from now on, he counted on her a lot to help her boss. Of course, Marin felt a bit awkward about getting money for a short nap, but thanked him from the heart, thinking about the chance she would have the next day. She was even confident about it for a while, but a week later, she was already going crazy because the Duke continued to avoid her. Without understanding the reason for the escape, she wondered why Gerald didn't want to sleep and refused to see her. The girl finished the day's mountain of paperwork, chose several books for him, and still had time to read her own. And now there she was, again in that dark hallway, wanting to talk to Gerald, who refused to see her. Then, she said for the entire hallway to hear that sleep was a basic human need and asked how he intended to live suffering like that. Actually, the girl didn't want to talk like that, but she had no choice. It had been days she had been trying to convince him that this was the best and only alternative she had. Finally, the MC shouted at the office door, asking if he was just afraid to sleep and saying that he should admit his weaknesses to her if he wanted this to work. The next day, Marin walked tired through the hallway with her books, not knowing whether she would be called again or dismissed as always. Until, suddenly, she heard voices saying that she was someone important and that she was helping the master. Watching from the corner, the MC saw several maids, including Yuria, while the other girls said her mistress was just an ordinary commoner. But Yuria defended Marin willingly while the others laughed and didn't take her seriously. They surrounded the maid and said they knew the truth about Marin. They knew she had only gone to the palace to sell her own body, and that she would never really help the master. They also spoke ill of her mother, saying she was arrogant and tried to look like a noble. This really bothered our girl. Yuria tried to protect the two at any cost, but the three maids went after her, with the worst possible intentions. One of them shouted that the orphan had dared to raise her voice to them, and that she needed a lesson. But when she raised her hand to hit Yuria, a book flew and hit her right in the back. The woman, furious and in pain, turned to see who had thrown the object. It was Marin, who irritatedly asked how they had the courage to raise their hand to someone, especially a co-worker. She called Yuria, and the maid realized this wasn't going to end well. Quickly, one of the maids grabbed the girl by the hair, saying she wasn't going to get close to the mistress. Luckily, Yuria managed to escape from that mean woman. Already out of patience, Marin stepped in front of her and ordered the girl to stay behind her body to protect her. But the woman didn't back down. In fact, she called Marin a tramp, asking how she dared to feel important and questioning if she thought she was important there, just because the Duke had given her a caress. The maid clearly wasn't in the mood for conversation and just wanted to teach the newly arrived employees a lesson. Fearing the worst, Yuria begged Marin not to get involved, promising she would resolve everything alone. But our girl wasn't going to allow her to be treated like that. So she pulled out her book, ready to hit those evil maids. She hit one with the book and then another, while the maids advanced on her. Of course, Yuria didn't stay out of it either. The girl ran to defend her mistress and tried to push the girls who were totally out of control. Chaos quickly set in. The maids fought among themselves like teenagers, and the boldest servant pulled Marin's hair. Thus, the rude woman who had called Marin a tramp got even more furious when she started to lose in the fight. Then she went after Marin, held her hands and declared that it was useless to fight, and that it was better for her to be quiet. Yuria even tried to get close to her mistress, but soon after was pushed by another maid. Our protagonist realized she was screwed. She couldn't do anything with one of the maids sitting right on top of her, especially considering the woman's strength. Luckily, the chief maid appeared, asking furiously what all that noise meant. She was face to face with a strange scene, a maid sitting on the floor, all messed up, and a third one mounted on top of Lady Marin. The butler appeared shortly after, and was so surprised he could hardly believe what he was seeing. Marin turned around and greeted Sebas as if nothing had happened. Of course she was lying on the floor, totally disheveled, but she continued to be a polite woman. Nervous, he pushed all the maids away with one hand, and the first thing he did was ask the MC to stand up as quickly as possible. The chief maid asked Yuria what had happened and why they had caused so much confusion, to which she responded explaining that the other maids called Mrs. Marin and her mother tramps and that she simply couldn't let it slide. Everyone there knew that the maids should behave in silence, and the butler watched all that without understanding anything. The chief maid understood she would be the first to be punished for that confusion, which she didn't even know was happening, and shouted loudly, asking how the girls dared to say those things. She states that those girls were guests of the Duke and that the maids had just stained the honor of the house, making it clear they would have to pay dearly for their malicious gossip. The maids fell silent, realizing the chaos they had caused and the consequences that would come soon. Embarrassed, the chief maid Paige personally apologized to Miss Marin, taking the blame for not having controlled those mindless girls. And she explains that, if only she had been insulted, perhaps she could forgive the women, but they had insulted her mother and the MC couldn't forget that. So, she suggested that since those maids were so lively, maybe it would be good for them to work in a place where they had to deal with fewer people, like a dump. She asked for close supervision to ensure that abuse against young maids wouldn't happen again, stating this couldn't be allowed at the Duke's house. Yuria's eyes filled with tears for them defending her honor for the first time since she arrived at the palace. Thus, Paige promised to ensure that would never happen again, and reinforced that the girls needed to apologize. With the matter almost resolved, the butler suggested that Marin go see the doctor to make sure everything was okay. Out of nowhere, Olive appeared, also curious to know what had happened after hearing the noise from the hallway. He saw Marin's messy hair, and it was very embarrassing for our girl to appear all flustered in front of her colleague like that. Of course, the boy had no idea what had gone down, but asked Marin to follow him, warning that the Duke had called her to the office to resolve something urgent. As soon as they entered Gerald's office, the boy asked what had happened, sensing a slight smell of blood. To which Marin responds that she had only had a slightly heated conversation with the maids, but Olive added that one of the employees was the one who had insulted her, and for this reason started a fight. The servant makes it clear that the reason for all this confusion was a comment by the employee about how Marin and her mother were nothing more than courtesans. Hearing this, the Duke ordered Olive to cut out the maids' tongues without thinking twice, being scolded by our girl, who got scared he would really go that far. She admitted she had already punished the girls by forcing them to work at the dump, and asked forgiveness for having acted without asking him first, but he thought she was too merciful for giving such a light punishment. Since this was resolved, Gerald questioned if she had won again, but the expression again sounded strange to her. The heroine realized he was talking about the time she had hit Giorno, although that wasn't something she always did. When the man insisted on the question, Marin sighed and said she hadn't lost. The boy noted that this had happened during the move and now again, commenting that he seemed to have brought a real bully into the castle, leaving the girl even more disconcerted. He gives a sideways smile at the MC's reaction, seeming to really have fun at the girl's expense. Playful, he comments that he could tell the girl was all messed up even without being able to see, even though she tried to deny it. Then the Duke approaches and grabs her arm, asking what she was relying on to be so brave and courageous with him. But Marin just looked away and couldn't answer, because she always felt strange around him and her heart beat strongly. Changing the subject, Gerald told Olive to get new clothes for the girl, since her sleeves were rolled up, which made the girl object because she didn't think it was so bad and could solve it herself. Serious, the boy said she just had to accept the gift and asked her not to misunderstand the reason for it, which only left Marin with more questions in her head, not understanding what kind of misunderstanding he meant. Quickly, he sent Olive back to work, and the young man obeyed as usual. The poor protagonist prayed for the boy to take her with him, but suddenly Gerald asked what she was doing, suggesting she should be working, since he had noticed the girl had brought a book again. Trying to compose herself, she asks if she could already begin reading, which she had postponed for a long time because of that confusion. But she was surprised when the Duke crossed his arms and said that normally he wasn't afraid of something like that. Marin definitely didn't expect that. She couldn't believe that was happening. The day before, she had shouted in the hallway that he was afraid to sleep, and Gerald certainly had heard her words, even though he had remained silent. Actually, she didn't think he could hear from inside the office, but now she was sure she was completely wrong. Smiling, the Duke suggested she begin reading to see how she would handle things this time. The book she chose was about the Siren Desert, which lay between the Omen Empire and the Sanders Empire, and was the ancient home of thousands of dangerous monsters. It was the duty of the Duke's family to contain the monsters that came out of the desert to ensure the safety of the people. A long time ago, the battle against the monsters had finally ended and only the remaining warriors needed to return home, but some problems arose. None of the scouts who had been sent on the search returned, so the Duke knew they couldn't advance until they found the missing ones. There was still no news of Henderson, who was a key piece for them. Then, one of his men informed him that he had found the cause of the knight's disappearance. But it was something so serious that he would have to see it with his own eyes. The scene was almost magical. The knights had reached a kind of garden with giant flowers. The armored knights stood before monstrous flowers, plants of sinister beauty that deceived their minds, until one of the men got closer, still unsure if he could touch that or not, but his curiosity ended up being greater, and he extended his hand with the steel glove, and when his finger touched the flower, the silence of the forest ended with a roar. From the middle of the flower emerged a huge mouth full of teeth, totally terrifying. Gerald had ordered them not to do anything risky, so the knights backed off. The perfume coming from the flowers was very sweet, even burning the Duke's nose, and it was this plant that made people confused. Gerald ordered everyone to cover their noses immediately, not breathe that air and get out of there so as not to be caught by the monsters. So that infernal flower attacked through smell. Knowing this, the boy ordered that the soldiers be taken from there as far as possible, but there were too many monsters for him to solve alone. However, the guy explains that it was difficult for someone to fight with one hand while holding their nose, and only the Duke would be able to do that, promising his right-hand man he would return soon. While slicing the monster, he imagined that there must be a center in the flower where something controlled its attacks. He was sure that by the way they grew in the garden, the flowers protected it in some way. After cutting many stems, the boy finally found what he wanted, the brain of that terrible monster. He approaches with his sword in hand, and finally strikes with the sword exactly in the center of the flower, so that all the other creatures would also die. Gathering all his will, Duke Gerald drove the blade deep into the heart of the plant, making a terrible scream echo, piercing the silence of the forest. At that moment, a flash struck the boy's eyes as if a lightning bolt had fallen in front of him, but even upon opening his eyes, the Duke realized he was still in darkness, and it was on that very day that he became blind. This time, the boy managed to fall asleep again. And when he awakened, he didn't even notice how much time had passed since Marin had been there. He didn't even remember when was the last time he had dreamed. Beside him was Mr. K, who told that the Duke had slept for about an hour and that he had been around the whole time. Sleeping was indeed wonderful. With just 1 hour of sleep, his body was already full of energy. As always, his thoughts fled to Marin and to how she was a strange and surprising woman, but also dangerous, someone who could both alleviate his pain and lock him in it forever. Now the boy was even less sure about what to do with her. Speaking of Marin, the woman still seemed disheveled because of the fight and knew she needed to change as quickly as possible. She felt she had a horrible appearance and wasn't surprised that Olive had been so surprised to see her. But her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Uriah, who was worried and wanted to know if everything was okay with her mistress. The girl answered yes, since the Duke hadn't even reprimanded her, so there was no reason for concern, and she assured that everything was fine with Uriah too. Unfortunately, that had already happened to her many times before, so the girl was used to the hostility and mockery of other maids. With a gentle voice, Marin called the maid by name and held her hand carefully so she would feel her support. She asked that Uriah never again say that was normal, and stated that if anyone offended her again, she could run to her, because the MC was willing to fight for her whenever she needed. Her words leave the girl emotional, and very grateful, not just for what she said, of course, but for the mistress having defended her earlier. But for Marin, she didn't need to thank her. After all, they hadn't only offended Uriah, but also her mother, and that was unacceptable. Changing the focus a bit, the girl comments that her mistress could treat her informally from now on. The MC was older than her, so it was the least she could do, and it would be hard to say no to Uriah when she asked for anything making puppy dog eyes. With everything resolved, the redhead offers to fix the protagonist's hair and mend her dress, which she accepts. After all, she didn't have so many clothes to throw away one more. Taking advantage of the subject, she asks what the meaning of a gift in the form of clothes was around there, which makes Uriah ask if she had received this gift from someone, but the girl explains that not exactly, she only thought about it because of the talk about mending the clothing. The maid thought for a moment and answered that, in the West, this really had a special meaning. It was said that the person who gives the gift wishes to possess the one who receives it. She explained that lovers usually give gifts with exactly that meaning, signifying the desire of possession. Hearing this, Marin was shocked and didn't know how to react to the maid's words. It can't be that Gerald saw her this way, right? Shortly after, Olive asked Marin and her mother to go to the visiting room, but she had no idea about the reason for the call. A very elegant woman greeted the two, and curious, the MC asked who she was, to which the girl responds, introducing herself as Edra Smul, a stylist from a dress shop called Blora, and she was there to make 2 dresses for the ladies. In the original story, Edra was the personal stylist of the main character. The women bowed politely to greet the artist properly, introducing themselves formally. However, Roanna couldn't even imagine why the Duke had decided to call a stylist to make dresses especially for her, even though Marin tried to explain. The MC asked if her mother also had the right to a dress, and the stylist confirmed that the Duke asked her to make outfits for both. That catches our girl by surprise, because she thought the gift was just for her. But in fact, the Duke didn't only think of Marin, but also took care of a dress for her mother. The girl had no idea he had this attentive side. More excited, the girl explains to her mother that since she helped Gerald the last time they saw each other, he probably decided to give a dress as a sign of gratitude. With that aside, Edra pulls out her measuring tape, excited to take the measurements of both and get to work. Marin remained still while the stylist walked around her, measuring all the girl's dimensions, but something caught Edra's attention. Although the girl introduced herself as a commoner by not having given any surname to her, Marin had a lot of familiarity with this measurement-taking process. Plus, the fact that they had ordered her to make as many dresses as the girl wanted was definitely something. Looking carefully at the MC, an idea arose in her head. Maybe that would turn into an order for a wedding dress, noting that it wasn't for nothing they had asked her to start with the underwear. In that case, she couldn't miss the chance. If she sewed the dress for the future Duchess, the fame of her atelier, which had been in decline, would spread again. The stylist decided to prove her worth with the best possible outfit, because if there were many clients and orders, she would become filthy rich. After all the measurements were taken, Edra suggested that Marin and her mother look at the catalog to choose a suitable model. Since the MC's mother wanted a winter dress, Edra recommended a high-collar design made of thick wool. Already for Marin, she suggested something in pastel colors, stating they suited her well, and recommended the second model in baby blue. The catalog contained many new styles that couldn't be found anywhere in the West, and Marin's mother was marveled by the fact that there wasn't a single ugly dress. But Marin explained that she wanted a dress that was easy to move in, making the woman suggest she take several models. Awkwardly, the MC explains that one comfortable dress would be enough, and asked her to recommend something for her mother. The stylist was surprised when she noticed that everything was happening exactly as His Excellency had predicted, and her comment leaves our girl confused. Then she explains that the Duke said the girls would probably choose only one dress each, and warned that, if this happened, he would buy the entire collection from the studio, offering 12 million in gold coins to Edre. Marin decided to look at the catalog carefully again to prevent the Duke from buying all the dresses in sequence in case she couldn't choose. She couldn't believe that Gerald was going to do something crazy like that. After trying on the dresses, Marin's head was in complete disorder. Food, money, a home. She had already received more than she deserved, and now the Duke was going to buy her a bunch of dresses on top of all that. She even felt a bit uncomfortable because all she could do for him was read stories to help him sleep. While she searched for a nice book to read to him at the library, Zero approached and asked if something had happened to the girl. His presence startled the girl, but he continued, wanting to know why she looked so tired. The boy asked if she shouldn't be happy, since they said she had spent the whole day choosing dresses. Information he heard from Olive, who was a real gossip by the way. But for some reason, her face didn't at all express the happiness she certainly should feel. Marin's lips were tense, as if she were deciding whether or not to tell the truth. Finally, the girl confessed that she was worried, because she felt that all she did was accept the Duke's favors without giving anything in return, and that this was too much for her. Zero had already started thinking that something bad had happened, but hearing that, he concluded that the Duke probably had more money than the Emperor himself, and Marin should worry about that. Trade with the desert was a monopoly of the ducal family, and he certainly should have a mountain of money. Marin hadn't thought of that before. She knew that the Duke was a fairly rich boy, but didn't imagine to what extent. Even so, no matter how rich he was, she felt she couldn't act this way and decided that she needed to repay him in some way for everything she had received gladly. A bit uncertain, Marin asked the boy how much stomach pain Mandelson's poison caused, and the young boy explained that this depended on the person, because each organism was individual. He couldn't help but notice she was very interested in the plant. Then she explains that she had heard the plant was also used as a remedy, so she got curious to find out if there was another plant that could help relieve stomach pain. Serious, the young man admitted he couldn't give any advice, since he clearly wasn't a doctor, to which the girl responds with an apology, explaining that he seemed to know everything, which wasn't entirely wrong to assume. With his ego inflated by the girl, Zero commented that he had a remedy that stopped stomach pain, but that it wasn't really an antidote, and questioned if Marin really needed it. With her confirmation, the boy agreed to deliver it to her. Thus he followed, while Marin tried to convince herself she was making a good choice. She wanted to help the Duke until the heroine of the story arrived, but she had to test how dangerous the poison from that plant was. And what better way to do that than experimenting with the method on herself? In my opinion, this was a great stupidity. The next morning, she went to the Duke's garden and immediately found that same dandelion. There were large flower buds growing there, and since she needed to squeeze the juice from the flowers, it was good to collect as much as possible. Our girl remained in the garden for a long time and didn't notice when it began to get dark. It was time to meet his lordship. For this reason, she wouldn't have time to extract the juice from the flowers, so Marin decided to simply eat the flower to test the effects on herself. In the office, she stood before the boy again and asked him to close his eyes calmly so she could begin reading. But Gerald soon felt a strange smell coming from the MC. After all, his sense of smell was too sensitive to anything. It was strange for her to think that the Duke could even smell the aroma of a flower chewed and swallowed by her. It was an incredible sensitivity, and the MC admitted that she had eaten some flowers, questioning if the aroma was distracting him. Hearing that, the boy asked if perhaps Olive was letting her go hungry, but she stated that he always took care of her and that she ate until she was more than satisfied, confessing that she had simply tasted the flower out of boredom. Gerald laughed at the answer and said he probably needed to try harder to occupy her mouth. Then, and Marin wanted to disappear from so much shame, trying not to fantasize too much about what that meant, the girl decides to begin her reading of the night. This time, it was a story about a widowed mother who lived with her kind and beautiful daughter. By a stroke of luck, the gentle mother had met a handsome young man and soon fell in love with him. Marin hadn't even read a paragraph when she felt something strange in her stomach. While she tried to read that one day, the mother told the daughter that she would have a new father. But her stomach growled loudly throughout the office, and our girl was hit by a surreal pain. The Duke asked if that was really a fairy tale, commenting that the writing seemed strange, but she insisted that everything was fine. Marin even tried to continue, but her stomach began to rumble louder and louder, and immense pain pierced her entire body. The girl fell to her knees, trying to explain that there was something wrong with her stomach, even though she couldn't put together the right words for it. Marin no longer had the strength to contain herself. Then she quickly interrupted the reading and ran to the exit, asking forgiveness from the Duke. The rumbling in Marin's stomach made the Duke smile slightly, but he soon began to laugh loudly, and the pleasant sound of his laughter echoed throughout the office. It was funny to think that all the girls he had met until then made every effort to look innocent, but Marin had just run to the bathroom and would probably be embarrassed even to look at his face the next day. After the laughing fit passed, the boy wondered if the flowers there had always had such a good aroma. When she finally arrived in her room, Marin felt embarrassed just thinking about the Duke laughing at her, thinking she could hardly face him again. She didn't imagine that, during the reading, she would run to the bathroom and all because of that damn flower. Ready to burn with shame, Marin blamed herself for everything and cursed for having tasted that flower precisely that night. Yuria entered her mistress's room suddenly, asking how she was feeling after seeing her run to the toilet. When the MC asked how she knew she was sick, the girl explained that the assistant had handed her a stomach remedy and told Yuria to take care of Marin. That is, now, not only did the Duke know that she had run to the bathroom, but also Olive, which was a double disaster for the poor protagonist. The girl lies down, explaining that her body was fine, but the same couldn't be said about her heart, and the maid even thought her mistress had a fever. But the MC explains that the temperature was definitely not her biggest problem, because at that moment she was ready to die of shame. Suddenly, Yuria saw a basket of dandelions and asked if she could use some of them. And sincerely, Marin said she could use everything because she felt nauseous just looking at them. The maid carefully took a flower and asked Marin to wait a bit, wanting to help her as quickly as possible. She had made a compress with the petals and put it on our girl's forehead, explaining that she had learned this as a child and that if she made a paste of dandelion with water and applied it, the person's temperature would drop quickly. Surprisingly, our girl's discomfort was diminishing little by little, which doesn't surprise Yuria, who told that she used to do this for her younger brother. Marin gets curious about the girl's brother, and she explains that the boy worked as an apprentice knight on the property. She was very grateful that the maid had taken care of her and for being so helpful. The next second, the girl jumped as if she had received a shock. This was all because Marin realized that although the plant was listed in manuals of poisonous herbs for causing stomach pain, it would hardly be possible to give dandelion to the Duke. However, she thought she could just apply it to his skin. Of course, she didn't know if it really was effective, but there was still a chance Marin could at least alleviate his suffering a little. She thanked the maid for her attention, and Yuria was happy to have been able to help her mistress, even though she didn't know exactly what Marin was talking about. The scene was a bit worrying to the maid, who looked at the MC as if she were crazy. Apparently, it wasn't for nothing that the assistant had told her not to take her eyes off her even for a second. The next day, the girl arrived at the boy's office, still feeling embarrassed after the escape to the bathroom the previous day. The Duke was even surprised that she had appeared, and the girl asks if something had happened, pretending she wasn't dying of shame, and the boy just said no. However, before reading the fairy tale, the girl decided to ask him for one thing, and Gerald questioned why he should attend to her request like that, to which she responds that what she wanted to do would be to help Gerald, which left him even more curious. The heroine asked him to trust her, but for that she would have to touch the Duke, so she requested his permission. Hearing this, a certain strangeness arose on Gerald's face, and he asked the girl to repeat what she had said. This worries the girl. Certainly he must have thought, how dare she touch him being a commoner? So Marin wanted to explain before he misunderstood her even more. She assured that it wasn't anything he was thinking, but the Duke was already approaching slowly. Gerald got very close to her and asked in her ear if the girl was warning him that she was going to attack him at that moment. The poor girl blushed like a ripe tomato and looked at the boy with surprised eyes, while the boy stared at her, waiting for an answer with his chest exposed in the half-open robe. Since the silence wasn't broken, he suggested that the MC was warning that she was about to attack him right in the neck, which she denies desperately, making the guy question if she hadn't just said she was going to touch him. Something that wasn't quite a lie, but he didn't know that. On a table next to them, there was a mortar with crushed dandelions, and on a tray, a white cloth. Still standing with the unbuttoned robe, the Duke asked where Marin wanted to start touching, and it was impossible not to notice his defined body. Even so, the MC tried not to look at the exposed part where she really wanted to touch him, but he was so handsome that the girl couldn't explain absolutely anything. Gerald questioned if she was an assassin or something like that and wanted to touch him with a sword, catching the lady by surprise. Certainly, the Duke was teasing her. Tired, Marin explained that she had brought a mixture made from crushed petals and that she had heard it was wonderful for relieving headaches, so she thought it could help. But Gerald admitted he hardly needed that because he felt great at that moment. Even so, the girl insisted that she knew the boy had a terrible headache every day because of work. She wanted to relieve the tension and asked him to try, promising that if the method didn't help, she wouldn't bother him anymore. Finally, the Duke agreed to accept the help, and she was very happy because she was already ready to be expelled from the office empty-handed. So it was time for her to shine. Marin carefully approaches the boy, moving his hair out of the way slowly. She felt an immense desire to remove Gerald's blindfold, but knew the Duke would be furious and wouldn't allow that to happen, so she just warned that she would apply her mixture. The boy asked why she was applying it on his eyes and not on his forehead, to which the MC responds that to get rid of a headache, it was necessary to cool down the heat accumulated in the eyes, making him ask if popular tales didn't say that ointment shouldn't be applied to healthy people. Already stressed, the girl applied while thinking that if she said it was a good remedy, he could just sit in silence. But Gerald asked if the MC was making all that pressure on purpose. But Marin assured that she in no way intended to harm him, she only wished to help him relieve the severe headache and eye fatigue. However silly it might seem, even with that plant before his eyes, he remained incredibly handsome to the protagonist's eyes, and to mine too. While the cloth with the crushed plants rested on his eyes, Gerald asked when she planned to begin reading, and Marin didn't even notice how she had gotten lost while admiring his face. She began to read again with a soft and gentle voice, hoping that this time the plant would help the boy feel at least a little less terrible. While reading the stories aloud, she noticed that as soon as she reached the last line of the tale, His Excellency woke up immediately. That's why she was constantly looking for stories that were at least a little longer, so that he would continue to sleep while she read them and not wake up after a few minutes. When she finished reading, the MC wondered if the boy was sleeping deeply that day, whispering that she would remove the bandage. She approached carefully and removed the cloth with the plants from his face, but at that moment, the Duke woke up. The boy quickly grabbed her hand and asked surprised what that was. Or rather, what kind of herb she had applied to his eyes. She didn't try to hide the truth, answering that it was weeds from the Duke's own garden, and that it was the same thing she had eaten the day before. Gerald guessed immediately by the smell, and his sense of smell was simply incredible, because he really didn't miss any. The Duke asked with interest what the weed was called, to which Marin responds that the flower was called Mandelson. After losing his vision, the boy had begun using a blindfold to protect his eyes from irritations. But whether his eyes were closed or open, any touch, even the lightest, burned him. However, that day, for the first time, he didn't feel the terrible burning sensation, even while the herb slowly wet the blindfold that covered his eyes. That had been touching his eyelids for a long time, but the Duke felt no pain at all. Already alone, after sending Marin to bed, he called his assistant immediately at dawn, wanting to tell what had happened. Zero entered the office with a sulky expression and wearing his pajamas, asking why the Duke had decided to wake him up so early just because he didn't sleep at a normal hour. At that moment, the cute little boy assumed his adult form, and a much more charming one. Olive asked Zero to lower his voice, but the young man got indignant, stating that the Duke had vision problems, not hearing problems, and that summoning everyone in the middle of the night was the real problem. Gerald reprimanded him for addressing him informally, but the alchemist said that, if he didn't like something, he could fire him, and that when he returned home, he could also receive the title of Duke. While they engaged in a silly discussion about titles, Olive remained calm until interrupting. And finally, the young man reported that Mr. Zero hadn't slept for 3 nights, developing a new remedy for the master, and that's why he dared to talk that way, leaving the boy angry for having given away the game. He even tried to shut the boy up, but Olive explained that this was why Zero was so irritated. He hadn't been sleeping properly for a long time. Gerald noted their loyalty, but didn't show surprise at how desperately Zero tried to help him. Without patience, Zero suggested that, if there were questions, it would be better to ask them quickly because he was incredibly sleepy and was going to return to his room regardless of anything. Gerald decided to ask about the plant Marin had applied to his eyes that night. And this makes the boy comment that, recently many people had been interested in that weed, and questioned if it hadn't been Marin who became interested in it by chance, because it was unlikely that any other person would have asked about it. Gerald called her the temporary employee, and even the alchemist was surprised to see that the Duke referred to her exactly that way, which was actually confirmed. And a slight playful smile appeared on the alchemist's face, who said he liked that girl so much that he suggested Gerald give her to him. But the Duke responded that that girl wasn't an object, although he still didn't call her by name. Impatient, Gerald stated that Zero was completely losing focus on what he was saying, and didn't understand the situation, until he finally revealed what was no longer a secret to anyone. Marin was only his. The man who had never succumbed to the temptations of countless noble girls now called a girl his. This really surprised Zero. Olive and the alchemist exchanged glances. That man had never said anything like that before, and it was the first time they heard such words from the boy. This meant only one thing. Things would definitely be more interesting now that he knew this. So Zero made it clear he would remember that conversation. Sometime later, he called Marin to talk. The boy notified her about an important matter, so she came without hesitation. She thought he had probably called her because of the plant she had used and that perhaps he wanted to ask more about the subject. Judging by the fact that the Duke had remained silent even after her arrival, it seemed there would be no problems. With the silence, the girl wondered, noting that perhaps because he sat in a dark, lonely room all the time, his skin had become much whiter than that of most other people. Marin hoped he didn't have any health problems. After all, the man barely slept and didn't see sunlight. Finally, Gerald says something, admitting that the girl had done a lot for him during that time, so he decided to give her a reward and asked what she would like to receive. It was a turn of events that came out of nowhere, for which not even the heroine herself was completely prepared. So she looked at the boy with surprise. The surprise proposal made her nervous, and she asked for time to think, making Gerald slowly count to make the girl think faster, but the faster he counted, the more she panicked. When he reached 3, Marin exclaimed that she wanted to go for a walk, repeating this in shouts from so much nervousness. But the Duke even asked again if it was really that, or if she had thought wrong. But the truth is that not even Marin knew how to say. The Duke jokingly said, "They said dogs need to be walked once a day," and apologized for not having noticed this before, remembering that on their first encounter, he had called Marin a little dog. Trying to get around the situation, she explains that the walk was like physical exercise. The girl thought it would be good for the Duke to walk a little, suggesting that since it was night, perhaps he wanted to try going out at least for a short period. Gerald was surprised and asked if she really thought his body needed exercise, which she denied quickly, commenting that he had a great physique. Marin only thought of his pale skin and how he always stayed in his office, and could have said she simply expressed herself poorly and asked that he spare her life regardless of anything she did. It was for this reason that the boy found the temporary so interesting, because any other one could have said she didn't think properly and asked for something else, but Marin didn't do that. Therefore, without hesitation, he said he was ready to fulfill her wish at that moment and even got up from the sofa to leave. Turning his head in her direction, the boy calmly suggested they take a walk. The thing is that Marin hadn't even said she'd like to go with him. But that's how they followed, with the moonlight illuminating the ducal castle, and before him stretched a field of dandelions swaying in the gentle night breeze, illuminated by the cold glow of the moon. Marin was incredibly enchanted, because that was the first time she saw that incredible vision. She even comments that she used to go there in search of flowers, but only now realized how much more beautiful that place was at night. The boy asks if she didn't mind the cold that there was at that hour, but the MC responds that no, and that the heat radiating from Gerald kept her warm. Marin seemed happy that the boy was leaning on her instead of using his cane, and comments that walking at night was a very good experience before asking if the garden lights were bothering him. To which he responds that thanks to her, no, because since he started using the plant, that amount of lighting didn't hurt him. But the mood gets heavy when our girl comments that she would really love it if his lordship could see what she saw too. Suddenly, he lowered his hand and advanced, while Marin stayed behind, calling his attention because it was dangerous for the Duke to walk alone. He looked even more handsome under the moonlight, raising his head to the sky as he enjoyed that atmosphere that unfortunately he couldn't see with his eyes. Until, suddenly, Gerald began to untie the black blindfold, something he had never done in front of Marin before. The two come face to face, and Marin gets lost in the vision in front of her. The Duke's eyes were white and deep, but it wasn't ugly at all, far from it. No, Gerald had eyes white as snow and silver, like the eyes of a fairy born of winter. There was no darkness in them, only a dazzling light. The boy broke the silence by asking if the girl in front of him was afraid to see him like that. He approached, questioning if she felt disgust at seeing his true form. Gerald was sure he looked like a monster. She felt a chill run through her body, and a wave of heat spread through her chest when she heard her boss suggest that she thought these things. When she answered no, our protagonist was asked the reason why she backed away in that case. Sincere, Marin explained that she only did so because he was very handsome. Gerald didn't expect to hear a compliment and was sure Marin would flee horrified by what she saw. But the MC's face lit up with genuine happiness, and she admitted being surprised at his beauty now that she had seen him without the blindfold. He approached even closer, ran his hand over her cheek and whispered that he regretted only one thing. He wished he could see her expression, but unfortunately it was impossible. After the incident with the monster, the color of his eyes had changed from black to silver, and silver was the color of the eyes of monsters in that world. So, he had spent the last years hiding his eyes at any cost, because he himself questioned if he hadn't become a terrible monster. But now, that woman who intrigued him so much was in front of him saying they were beautiful. Suddenly, the moment of the two was interrupted when someone shouted for the Duke. It was Olive, who arrived panting and made his master question the reason for all that commotion and why the assistant was so nervous. Apparently, the boy was carrying a letter in his hands and explained that it had just arrived, being a very important message. The letter with the red seal was special. It revealed that the Count's wife had recently passed away. Marin held her breath. She knew who that woman was to Gerald, and that unfortunately they were close relatives. He remembered the girl as a child, calling him a brat in the middle of her games. Back then, the young master didn't like that his sister called him as if he were a small child and wanted to grow up as quickly as possible. Gerald was short, and his sister frequently mocked him because he didn't even reach her waist, which is why she called him baby, leaving him even more stressed, even though she offered sweets in compensation. But the young boy frowned and promised every time that he wouldn't play with his little sister anymore, even with the bribery. She knew the boy's character very well. She knew he would regret it, especially after seeing the size of the sweet she had brought that time. The girl laughed because she was ready to do anything for her little brother, even fetch real stars from the sky. Holding out her pinky finger, she asked him to promise he would continue playing with her and that he would never get offended again. The relationship between them was very close. The sister loved the brother intensely when they were children and were always together. However, the day Gerald would have to keep the promise made to his sister never came, and unfortunately, the situation transformed into a real horror. This happened because the blood secret manifested too early. Even a low sigh hit his ears as if his eardrums were about to burst, and he didn't understand anything. His sister also didn't understand why the parents wouldn't help Gerald when he felt so much pain, but unfortunately, they couldn't do anything. The boy lay on the floor and cried bitterly from the unbearable buzzing in his ears, while the girl shouted that he was hurt and someone needed to do whatever it took to help. The boy was only 5 years old when he began to live the torments of hell, and unfortunately had to deal with this alone. Because from that day on, he was locked in a huge tower and lived solitary. Having learned from his father about the blood secret, he dedicated himself entirely to the practice of controlling the 5 senses he still had. As a result, the time spent in complete solitude became much greater than the time the young master spent with his family. On one of those days, while sinking into solitude, the boy heard a painfully familiar voice that gave him chills, calling him affectionately a brat. He couldn't help but recognize it, because throughout his childhood, it was that voice that had supported him in difficult times and was always there. It was his now-grown sister who now knew everything about the family secret and also about her younger brother's condition. She also knew very well that the young master could hear her voice even from far away, and there was no need to approach him secretly. The sister told that their father had gone too far. He didn't want to let the girl say goodbye to her brother before going away with her new husband. She really wanted to tell him about her husband, a handsome and gentle man with whom she had decided to spend her entire life. The sister even promised to live well and asked Gerald that as soon as he managed to leave the tower, she would be eager to see him in the south. Just like in childhood, she held out her pinky finger and was sure the brat would understand her and feel it. And so it was, because warmth hit the little boy's hand. However, she really wanted to see how he had grown, wondering if he had already reached the height of her waist. Tears ran down her face as she lamented the fact that she couldn't give a simple hug to her brother. Gerald heard every word and decided that his sister should know that he could hear her even from far away. Until he had an idea, he threw a stone from the window, which broke quickly. He had tied a cloth with a note congratulating his sister on the wedding. The girl took the stone in her hands and upon seeing the message, began to cry even louder, thanking her dear brother. Gerald, on the other hand, looked through the broken window and just prayed that his sister would now live well and happily with her new husband in her new life. That was the last meeting between them, the last conversation of the two, and today the boy's black carriage arrived at the huge palace. Knowing he wouldn't find the woman there, an assistant stopped beside Gerald and asked the boy to take a special cane with a silver engraving. It was an unusual object. Mr. Zero had asked him to take the cane, and the boy simply needed it today. At first, the Duke didn't understand why the alchemist asked him to take that item in particular, since he had never traveled with something like that before. But as soon as he pulled the handle with one finger, he immediately realized that the cane contained a very sharp blade. So he asked Olive to tell Zero that the alchemist had done a very good job and seemed to know that the Duke would definitely need that item today. Before he entered the carriage, someone shouted for Gerald. It was Maureen, running in his direction with a suitcase and shouting that she would also like to go. She bowed deeply before the boy, and he called her again temporary, as he always did. Gerald comments that he had heard from Olive that the girl couldn't ride in a carriage and asked if she would be okay during the trip. But despite her saying she had no problems, he thought that even if she could, the swaying would be too difficult for her condition. The boy knew how she felt, but warned her not to overdo it, and stated he could take care of himself. What worried Maureen most was the fact that the boy had barely slept in recent days, and she just wanted to read a book to him in the carriage so he could rest, but she was interrupted by Gerald, who, leaning on his cane, promised to return soon and guaranteed that everything would work out. Defeated, Marin handed him a brown box and asked that he at least take it, because inside was the same Mandelson herb she used with him. Without thinking twice, the Duke accepted the gift, knowing he would certainly need it on the trip so that headaches wouldn't bother him. For some reason, Marin felt very nervous when she saw the carriage. She stopped again, taken by fear, but tried to calm down, thinking that no one would get hurt. Gerald entered the carriage, which began to slowly move away from the castle, while Marin followed him with her eyes, deeply wishing him a good trip. Sometime later, a strong punch to the desk was heard in one of the nobles' offices as soon as the news arrived that Duke Gerald was coming. The young man was indignant. He had warned him not to come because of his eyes. However, his charming wife approached and asked the boy not to worry because there was nothing he could do since the Duke was on his way. Since things had taken this course, she said they would have to prepare a luxurious reception and greet Gerald in the best way. In the house of Count Adrien, the sun shone with the Duke's arrival. Everything was prepared in the best possible way. And as soon as the butler Moreau met the boy, he bowed deeply and commented that the Duke had made a very long journey. Gerald was serious, leaning on his cane next to his assistant. Olive said that the Duke had warned he would arrive before the funeral and asked where the Count's children were. The Duke heard voices talking about his arrival, and someone doubted that a blind guy like him would go that far, and probably not everyone was happy to see him there. He clearly heard the unpleasant conversation that was going on in the office, despite the boy thinking there was no way Gerald could hear a conversation that was happening so far away. Finally, the owners of the house came to receive our boy. It was Baron Killen, the younger brother of Count Adrian, accompanied by his fiancée, and he admitted that if he had had more time, he would have made a formal reception that day. He introduced his charming fiancée, who felt honored to appear personally before His Excellency. The girl, who wore a black velvet dress and had red hair, was called Jelmia Rose and had just become engaged to the Baron. Gerald didn't respond to her greeting, and Olive remained silent, observing the couple. The boy quickly asked where his nephews were, but for some reason, the Baron began to get nervous. He said with a fake voice of sadness that the blow had been too strong for the children and that they were still locked in their rooms, taken by mourning. But Olive was indignant, commenting that since the Duke himself had honored the house with his visit, they should at least have greeted him. Even so, the Baron said he had recently scolded them. Gerald never tolerated lies. He could identify them from afar and struck the silver tip of the cane hard on the floor, imposing himself without saying a word. Killen and his fiancée didn't expect the Duke to be so harsh right off the bat, retreating shocked. The young man questioned why the Duke allowed himself such insolence, stating that there was real mourning there. Taking advantage of the opening, Gerald asked how he could speak of welcome parties since they were going through intense mourning. He passed by the guards while the Baron tried to justify himself and ordered that his nephews be called at that very moment. The butler offered to accompany Gerald to the living room, while Killen was so furious he couldn't stop trembling, showing his teeth like an animal. It was absurd. The Duke was acting like a wild animal to them. The fiancée was indignant at the fact that someone would disregard the Baron so much just because of his title. And she comments if her beloved were a count, he wouldn't have been ignored that way. The boy hugged his beloved, saying that soon she would become a countess, but explained that he needed to be patient to get the high title. However, the girl's head was far away. After all, she didn't understand how the Duke had managed to arrive before the funeral. By his swiftness, it seemed he valued the sister much more than she thought, and things were taking an interesting turn for Jelmia. Sometime later, the Baron walked furiously to his office, cursing Gerald, who had arrived on a completely different day than he expected. He hated him. His sister-in-law from the Vines family was a problem, always putting obstacles in his way, and now his nephews would be too. Killen was sure the Duke suspected something, so it was impossible to scold his nieces now. Then he would have to take control of the situation no matter what. There was almost no time left. Now he just needed to endure one more day so that the title of Count would finally be in his hands. Upon opening the huge lock that locked the door, the Baron entered the room and asked if the children had been obedient while he was away. The atmosphere there was tense, and the girls seemed terrified of their tutor's presence. The eldest daughter of Count Adrian, Daya, looked angrily at the tutor, knowing what to expect from him, as did the second daughter, Garnet, who sat next to her sister Rubiana, who trembled with fear for being the youngest there. Cold, Killen asked why no one had greeted him since it was their uncle who had entered and demanded attention. But Garnet called that man a demon right then, saying he had locked them up there and even hidden the youngest one, Pedro, somewhere. There was no mercy in that man, who turned to the young girl with all his anger, asking how she dared to speak to him in that manner. Daya looked desperate and apologized with a trembling voice. When Garnet tried to talk back to her uncle again, the girl asked her sister not to interfere and showed herself ready to resolve the matter alone, so as not to see that man's fury. Killen seemed satisfied with the effect he had on the girls and said today he would let it pass, but promised that next time that definitely wouldn't happen. The boy told about the arrival of the Duke Vines, and Daya understood that only he could be their salvation. She could hardly believe it, so she asked if the Duke had really gone there. Completely changing his expression, the Baron warned that before the Duke, they should go back to pretending everything was fine because in the past, the relationship between them was good. Daya knew she would have to obey, but found all that an enormous filthiness. The uncle hated everyone there. Squeezing her fist to hold back, she asked that if they complied, the uncle would let them see Pedro the next day. To which he responds that everything depended on how the girls behaved in front of Gerald, because they needed to watch what they said and stay quiet so he wouldn't discover what was happening there. And then he ordered that everyone dress in the most beautiful way possible for dinner and come down to greet the Duke. As soon as he left, Garnet shouted, asking if her sister had gone crazy and why she was humiliating herself like that before that demon. But Daya understood that this was the only chance they had, otherwise the uncle might not let them see Pedro at all. Unfortunately, that was the cruel truth, and the green-eyed little girl asked her sister if they could really meet the boy the next day. Daya approached with a discouraged smile and promised they would certainly see him, and the girl really wished this day would come as quickly as possible. She questioned her sister if the Duke could help them get out of there, which leaves Garnet indignant, because according to her, the Duke had never visited them and she considered him a complete stranger, and even their uncle, with whom they were close, managed to betray them, so she questioned if a person who had lived their entire life as a stranger could really help them in any way. The little one with sad eyes admitted that her mother always said that, and Daya completed the saying about how the Vines family protected itself. Gerald Vines was in fact there for the first time, and none of them knew what kind of person he was. But our boy knew very well about that saying. 15 days earlier, a cheerful boy with dark gray eyes and a happy face approached his sister, commenting that his father and mother had promised him a birthday gift, and he wanted them and Daya to choose it together. His mother was already waiting for him in the carriage to choose the best birthday gift, calling Pedro to go. He promised his sister he would be back soon, and at that moment, the family was very happy to be together. She touched the boy's nose affectionately and asked him not to get into trouble and to behave very well. That was the last meeting they had. Sometime later, the bodies of the parents were found, but the boy Pedro disappeared without a trace after the tragedy. Daya needed to find her brother. But she needed help for that, so first she turned to her father's vassals, but many just avoided her. The girl didn't understand why everything was happening so strangely, why her mother had suffered a tragic accident, and she was left with only the option of turning to her uncle. Killan, upon seeing the young girl, asked why she was so pale, and if she needed a doctor's help. But Daya explained that the vassals didn't answer her questions, avoided meetings, and that no one was looking for her little brother, reinforcing that she needed help. Everyone was ignoring the matter, while Daya seemed to be intruding on something that wasn't her business, and the uncle declared that now she needed to understand why the vassals avoided her if it really wasn't obvious. He warned her that she needed to stay quiet until the funeral, if she wanted to see her little brother Pedro, who had disappeared without a trace. Only now did Daya realize that that terrible man had hidden the boy somewhere, probably so he wouldn't tell all the details of the tragedy. Without thinking twice, he gave her a strong slap on the face, making it clear she shouldn't dare to behave that way again. Killan was furious when he said it was good for the girl to mind her tongue and ordered her to go up immediately to the room with her younger sister, adding that, if she behaved, perhaps he would bring her little Pedro alive and safe and sound. She had no choice but to become obedient, because only that way perhaps she could see her brother. For that, she needed to listen to that man, not make noise and stay in the room according to his orders. Thus, the Baron locked them up with an iron chain and a huge padlock there. Daya tried to keep strong while she felt an incredible longing for her mother and remembered her with tears in her eyes. She remembered when she was still just a child and asked about her mother's brother because she really wanted to know why he didn't visit them. To which her mother responded that the Vines family had too many enemies, that they were protecting their own family and that, even if he wanted to, he couldn't come. She always repeated that no matter what happened, the girl should remember one thing. The Duke of Vines protected them, and her little brother would protect all his daughters without thinking twice. Now she was telling the same story to her little sister, and both were sure that man could help them. Despite this, the young girl questioned if His Grace, the Duke Vines, who hadn't even responded to the letters sent during all this time, would really defend her. Gerald, on the other hand, was very eager to deal with Killan immediately, but knew the time wasn't right yet. His hidden assistant, Kai, had been tracking him for a long time, and soon he should expose him. It was only necessary to wait a little. His thoughts were interrupted when Olive reported that the young Killan was organizing tomorrow's funeral well and commented that most of the southern aristocrats had not received any invitation. But that wasn't all, and from Olive's somber face you could tell there was still some terrible information. Apparently the bodies of the Count and Countess were so damaged that they were cremated immediately, but Gerald couldn't believe this. This information makes him grit his teeth hard. It was a completely reckless attitude, and the Duke discovered that the Baron had dared to stain the memory of his family without caring even a little about respect and protocols. Meanwhile, in Duke Vines' castle, Marin looked at the map of the region, indignant because the Duke had traveled the huge distance in less than a week, and even at an accelerated pace, the journey would have taken at least 10 days. She couldn't stop thinking about how the Duke must be feeling. He didn't like noise, and the MC wondered how he would endure all that, plus thinking that the dandelion tincture had probably already run out. The main problem was that the boy hadn't slept at all, and Marin still blamed herself for not having gone with him. She had promised he would be able to sleep a little, but couldn't even enter the carriage because of motion sickness, feeling pathetic about it. But her lamentation was interrupted by a white-haired boy who asked why the girl had such a serious face. His presence was a surprise to Marin, who asked who he was. Then the young man introduced himself as Zero's older brother, Jerome Rodel Zart. Now the heroine understood what the boy really looked like. However, something caught her attention. His last name was Zart. Like the ducal family of the north, why would the heir of the northern duke be in the west? This information wasn't even in the original story, which left the girl even more surprised, and the young man asked if there was something on his face. The girl laughed awkwardly and answered that the boy was very similar to Zero, and that's why she couldn't stop looking at him. Marin even forgot to introduce herself and then said her name, changing the subject. The boy commented that it was a pleasure, but insisted on knowing if he really looked so much like his brother. And she says he was the spitting image of the little boy, and that was exactly how little Zero would look when he grew up, which was lucky for him in Jerome's view. Apparently the boy knew his worth well. To be honest, he considered himself a very attractive young man, or rather, the most beautiful in the Empire. Even Marin comments that she had never seen a man so charming and handsome who was as pure as he was before. Her compliments leave the boy a bit confused, but Marin was sincere in her words. That's when she realized she hadn't answered his question, so the boy repeats that he wanted to know what was worrying her so much. which left her with worried eyes again. Without hiding anything, the girl explains that during all this time she had been thinking about the Duke, and that thoughts about him simply wouldn't leave her head all day. Even the young man noted that he worried her too much, something not even Marin herself liked to admit. She denied it, stating that it definitely wasn't anything like that, and Jerome realized how everything was developing in an interesting way between them. The only thing the girl couldn't hide was her deep feelings for Gerald, which were given away by the color of her cheeks. Marin was sure that, being the strongest and most reliable hero of the Empire, the Duke would go through all the trials and find happiness, so there was no need to worry about him. But no matter how much she tried to compose herself, the boy wouldn't leave her mind, and this became even more evident after his departure. Sometime later, the girl went to the stables to give affection to the horses, carefully petting the snout of the horse, white as snow, who felt her warmth. The girl wondered how long she would have to perfect her skills to leave just like the Countess, and the horse rubbed his nose against her cheek, as if he sensed Marin was worried about something. The girl laughed, more excited about the idea that the horse was licking her face to get her out of the spiral of bad thoughts. Suddenly, Sebas appeared with his usual friendly smile. Our girl didn't expect to find him there, and when she asked what had brought the butler to the stables, he answered that he just needed a quiet place to think. He told that since he was a knight, he used to go there when anxiety tormented his head, and today, out of an old habit, he had gone there again. The butler's face was clouded with worry. Certainly something must have happened. But Marin couldn't even question that, because he changed the subject by asking if you could tell that he was taking very good care of the horse every day, to which she responds that the animal looked great, and despite advanced age, his coat was shiny and he was full of strength. Smiling, Sebas revealed that that horse had belonged to the young Countess Adria, and it was evident how well it was taken care of in the Duke's house. The Countess loved riding and frequently begged her butler to teach her fencing skills, but because of his duties as vice commander of the Order of Knights, Sebas hardly had time for the lessons. Hearing these stories, Marin comments that the Countess must have been a very active person, and the man admitted that, indeed, that girl was full of vitality. The man's heart still ached terribly for everything that had happened, and the MC decided to leave him alone with his memories of the Countess because of that. Before she could leave, the butler apologized for having spoken so much, remembering that the girl seemed bothered by something, so he said she could vent to him if she wanted. But the MC explains that it wasn't anything serious. In fact, she had only thought that if she knew how to ride a little better, perhaps she could accompany the Duke on that trip. The butler was surprised that those were the thoughts visiting her. Apparently, the girl was really worried about her master. Awkwardly, the girl completes that perhaps she was wrong. After all, even if she were, certainly she wouldn't be of much help. After hearing this, Sebas suggests that he could teach her how to ride, which surprises her, and our girl accepts with great pleasure, although she was afraid of taking up too much of the boy's time. But he answered gently that it wouldn't be a problem for him, because Sebas still lamented that, when the Countess asked to learn, he hadn't been able to dedicate enough time to her, and he didn't want to feel such regrets anymore. And he even added that it would be good if Marin also learned fencing for self-defense if she had interest in it, to which she responds, questioning if she wasn't already too old for that. Friendly, the butler explains that it was never too late to learn, and was confident that, if Marin mastered this art, one day she could be useful to the Duke. With that, the girl accepted, ready to know everything about horses and swords, and promised to study hard so that the butler wouldn't regret his decision. Which makes him smile sweetly with happiness that the girl had agreed, feeling that he would finally be able to fill the void he had inside because of the past. Meanwhile, at the Baron's house, Dia looked at the banquet in front of her with disgust. She knew that so much food in time of mourning was a waste, but she thought that if it helped feed the younger ones, it was better to face this as something good. Finally, the Duke arrived for the meal, and everyone greeted the boy when he entered the dining room. The girls stood up to greet him little by little. As soon as Dia saw the Duke, she couldn't take her eyes off him. That man was incredibly similar to her mother. Gerald approached Killen first, facing him completely seriously with the cane in his hands. The Baron got up immediately and pulled out the chair so the Duke could sit, ordering loudly for the children to greet their uncle politely. Dia spoke up, saying it was an honor to meet the Duke for the first time, said her name and introduced herself as the eldest daughter. Then the second daughter, Garnet, introduced herself and said the name of the youngest, the third daughter, Rubiena, who commented on her uncle's height. With the introductions finished, the Baron interrupted and stated that, since the Duke would share the meal with them today, he had ordered the chef to do his best, and offered the boy to taste the delicious dishes. Gerald didn't respond to anything. He hated that man like no one on earth. Then Olive spoke up, explaining that his master had no appetite today, but that everyone else could begin the meal. The Baron was indignant at the boy's behavior, mentally calling him a blind cripple, and was extremely unhappy about that, although he just agreed with the order. Little Rubiena was the first to exclaim about the delicious dishes on the table, and Dia watched carefully to ensure the girl ate well. The Duke watched the interaction between the girls attentively, almost as if he were studying them. When they finished eating, Olive asked the maid to clear the seats and prepare the rooms for the youngest ones. The maid asked the girls and the little sister to go to the room, and one of the older daughters looked threateningly at the Baron, who was without understanding what was happening. Nervous, Killen protested to the Duke. He started to get very out of control and turned to the boy, asking what all that meant and why he had sent the girls away. Killen could barely contain his rage and shouted that, no matter how high Gerald's status was, he couldn't do that. However, he was surprised when, with an agile movement of the hand, the Duke brandished the blade hidden in his cane and made a small cut on the boy's face. Gerald spoke harshly for him to be quiet at once, but the Baron was indignant. I mean, the Duke had just cut his face, and he reminded him that in the Empire there were laws prohibiting wounding a noble like this without reason. Without showing the slightest concern, Olive handed the Baron a white handkerchief, commenting that he was very wounded, and then suggested that Killen calm down because he could easily stop the bleeding with that handkerchief. The Baron snatched the handkerchief from the hands of the Duke's assistant, who smiled back because he didn't have much choice at the moment, but his movement was so fast that only afterward did he understand it wasn't just a handkerchief, and when he realized, it was too late. Terror took hold of Killen's face. Quickly, the Duke withdrew a sharp blade from his cane, and confidently declared that since the Baron had accepted the handkerchief, this meant he agreed with a duel between the two. Outside the dining room, Daya clearly heard the word duel and wondered what was happening there. She decided to see everything with her own eyes and asked her sister to take care of the youngest in the meantime. Garnet understood her but asked her to come back to tell everything that was happening between the Duke and the Baron. However, before she entered, Olive insisted that she return because that might not be the most pleasant scenario for the girl, but Daya asked them to let her stay anyway. After all, in a few months she would already be an adult girl and felt ready to take on greater responsibilities. Plus, as the eldest daughter of Count Adrian, the girl wanted to see with her eyes everything that really occurred in that mansion. Outraged, the Baron shouted loudly that the Duke had deceived him and that the challenge to the duel was invalid. He noticed the young girl entering the dining room again, which meant she had certainly seen him not consent to that confrontation. However, Daya declared loudly that she had seen with her own eyes how the Baron had received the white handkerchief and had heard the Duke's announcements about the duel. Therefore, that was a legal procedure, and that the Baron didn't have the right to refuse it. Killen couldn't believe that the girl had allied herself with Gerald even though she had seen him for the first time that night. But as soon as he tried to shout at her, a thin and sharp blade touched his chin, and Gerald warned him that, during a duel, he should never get distracted with anything. And the Baron understood the disadvantage in which he found himself. The young man fell to his knees before him and declared that he had no idea what he had done wrong, but begged forgiveness as many times as needed. After all, he knew that someone like him would never be able to compete with the Duke, who was known as the Empire's shield, and that duel would be a failure. Without the slightest piety, the Duke questioned if, even knowing all that, the boy insisted on doing something so stupid. At that moment, the boy understood he had been caught. The Duke accused the Baron of having dared to touch his family while he tried to dodge, claiming the boy had misunderstood everything. Killen even tried to ask Daya for help to convince Gerald that this was some kind of terrible misunderstanding and that it was worth explaining what had happened. But all the girl did was ask where Pedro was. Of course the man feigned ignorance, but she wasn't going to give in. The girl still didn't know where her brother was. So, irritated, she grabbed the Baron by the collar and shouted that he should hand over the boy immediately, stating that she didn't care if he would die or not. However, the Baron responded with a trembling voice that he had no idea where her younger brother was, and revealed that in fact he had also spent all this time looking for little Pedro, but the girl couldn't believe that lie. She remembered that he himself had said before that Pedro was with him, and that this was the only reason she had allowed them to be locked up and starve, so she could see her brother. But now he dared to say nonsense about not knowing the boy's whereabouts, which was absurd. For a long time, she had tolerated his terrible treatment of her and her sisters, and she was ready to kill him right there. She couldn't contain the rage as the pain increased in her heart until Olive asked the girl to calm down, but she didn't listen. Suddenly, with a quick movement, the Baron pulled a knife from his pocket, grabbed the young girl by the neck and ordered that no one move, warning that, if they attacked him one more time, he would end the girl. Gerald, however, didn't seem afraid of his threat, and asked if the Baron would really be capable of doing that, which only left Killen more indignant, making him question why he thought he couldn't kill his niece. Thus, Gerald approached him slowly, and the young man shouted again for no one in that room to leave, which makes Daya close her eyes tightly, already expecting the worst. The sharp blade grazed her ear and locks of hair fell slowly to the floor. The metal stayed only a few centimeters from her face, this being just Gerald's first warning. Killen's eyes rolled back with fear, because if he had moved a little to the side, the Duke could easily have cut his face in half. Finally, his knees gave way, and the boy collapsed on the floor as if he were nothing. And Gerald just observes the scene without any reaction. Meanwhile, looking at the unconscious Baron, the girl asked if he was dead, but that was out of the question. She couldn't believe that justice had finally been done after so much time. Olive declared that the Baron would be brought to trial before all the nobility, so that everyone would see the price of the audacity of raising a hand against someone of the ducal family. And finally, he promised that, from now on, no one would harm the girl nor her sisters. That makes Daya cry with joy, thinking that, if it weren't for Duke Gerald, the Baron would have been able to do something terrible to them, just as he had done to her family. In the end, her mother was right. The Vines family protected itself no matter what. The next day, Kai went to Gerald and reported that no trace of the people behind that could be found. It seemed that the Baron's fiancé had erased all traces before disappearing, in a very well thought out plan. Plus, the Duke was a variable the woman didn't consider. She probably would have used Killen longer if he hadn't arrived in time. The two are interrupted when someone enters the office. It was Olive who brought Miss Daya because she had decided to talk to Gerald personally. The girl bowed and thanked him for the favor she would never forget, saying that now all that remained was to find her little brother. Suddenly, the Duke announced he was ready to become the girl's guardian as soon as possible, something she didn't expect at all. However, he explains that there was clearly someone very powerful behind all that, and until that person was found, she needed protection. The girl understood perfectly what all that meant and suggested that the Duke stay until they found little Pedro, at least. Through the open window, the cawing of a huge black crow was heard, which landed on a branch of a tree near the mansion, drawing the Duke's attention, who asked if there was any tower there, a high place where birds could rest. To which Daya responds, explaining that behind the mansion, in a small grove, there was an old bell tower of a temple, but she still had no idea why the Duke had asked that, only that Gerald just answered that there was no time for explanations at the moment. He just needed her to take him there as quickly as possible. Flashbacks of a letter that Gerald's sister had written him come to his mind. She wanted to know more about his adult life and if he still got offended when called a baby. The woman talked about the soft southern sun, a peaceful corner that the evil monsters avoided, and said how much she wanted to show her husband what her fencing training had taught her. A few days earlier, she was walking alone and came across a place that resembled the tower where her brother had lived throughout his childhood. As soon as she entered, memories of her brother flooded her mind, so she had filled the place with his favorite toys. Even though he didn't even play anymore, the girl wished a place where she could miss her brother in silence. And she dreamed that one day she would be able to invite him to that isolated refuge, until someone followed him there. Her youngest son had accompanied her without the woman even noticing, and learned to love that place. Nostalgic, the woman comments that she wished the little one would grow up as wonderful as Gerald. Furthermore, the baby was incredibly similar to Gerald, and that, like all children love secrets, he was enchanted by the idea of having a secret room. Probably she would have to pass the place on to Pedro someday. However, now little Pedro sat alone in a dark room, complaining of hunger. The boy was sad for not having stretched out the snack he had taken in secret, but now it was too late and he had drunk the rainwater to the last drop. The reality is that he didn't understand why he was there and where his beloved mother had gone. That terrible night, his mother had asked him to count to 500, and if she didn't return by then, he needed to run to the secret room as quickly as possible and hide there. The little boy didn't understand why they couldn't go together, and his mother had promised she only needed to expel the evil man, ordering him not to leave under any circumstances, no matter who called him, even if it were his sisters. And in case she didn't come, he should wait until the Duke Vines arrived to save him, because his uncle would find him and would certainly protect him. Gerald knew perfectly where the baby was, remembering the secret room whose door was locked. That was frustrating. And the boy heard Pedro's heartbeats getting louder and louder. The girl looked at him confused. She had received orders to accompany Gerald and went with him there, but there was something missing. The Duke asked Olive if he knew how to open the door without scaring the child even more. At that moment, Daya couldn't believe what she was hearing. Was it possible that young Master Pedro had been there the whole time? She began pounding on the door with her fists and with tears in her eyes, asked her little brother to at least answer something. If he really was in that room, she begged him to say at least one word. But all there was an absolute silence behind the door, because his mother had strictly forbidden the son to respond to any voice, even if it was his sister's. The girl seemed to have lost all hope and thought her beloved brother wasn't there. After all, if he had been there, he would have heard her voice and certainly would have answered, which, unfortunately, didn't happen. She had never seen Pedro climb up that tower and asked the Duke why he was sure the boy was there. But Gerald was absolutely sure the baby was behind that room. And if he wasn't coming out even hearing his sister's voice, there was a good reason for it. The Duke heard his heavy breathing behind the door and knew the boy was right there. Trembling all over, Pedro heard someone approach the door and, remembering his mother's words, covered his mouth with his hands so his crying wouldn't be heard. Finally, the boy suggested that Pedro must be afraid that his family was being held hostage and simply couldn't force himself to come out. But Daya didn't understand. Her brother wasn't even 6 years old. How could he really think of such a thing? Then Gerald explained that his mother must have warned him in advance that something like that could happen. The girl questioned if they would have to break down the door, while Olive tried to calm her, saying that the boy was already very scared. He needed a little time. That child was probably already exhausted and reaching the limit. For this reason, they couldn't simply break down the door and risk scaring him even more. The problem is that no one knew what the mother had said to the son, so Gerald tried to put himself in the sister's place for a moment. The Duke called the boy, introducing himself as Duke Gerald von Vines, and declared that whoever was outside had come to protect them. Upon hearing that name, the little one disarmed. The door opened silently. His sister could hardly believe the scene. Indeed, Pedro had been there the whole time. Exhausted and with tired eyes, he opened the door slowly and came out to meet the people. Upon hearing the Duke's voice, the boy said his name again so the little one would stop being afraid, introducing himself as the venerable Gerald von Vines. Little Pedro's eyes filled with tears because for the first time in all the time he had spent alone and afraid, he felt relief. He would be saved. And our boy called him to finally take him home, but he was so exhausted he couldn't stand, and his sister immediately ran to help him, holding him by the shoulder, until Gerald took the exhausted boy in his arms, pressing him against his chest while he apologized for having taken so long. Pedro was finished and buried his face in the soft fabric of the Duke's shirt while he cried his heart out. Daya also cried, but with joy for finally being with her brother. Gerald felt the child's body shake and quickly remembered his sister, promising once again that he would do his best to protect her children in her memory. At that moment, in the silence of the abandoned tower, an invisible connection arose between them, a bond that would never be broken. Meanwhile, Marin wasn't bored at all at the ducal mansion because she was committed to learning fencing. She held the sword with uncertainty in her hands, but knew she would certainly succeed under the butler's attentive guidance. That day, he suggested starting by practicing with a common stick to understand and feel how to control the sword. When the girl questioned if he himself had made that sword, Sebas explained that those were the swords used by young fencers, and he had chosen one of those because he thought a real adult sword would seem a bit intimidating to Marin, who certainly wasn't ready to wield a real weapon. Thus, Marin's intense training routine began, and on the first day, she trained with a beginner knight's sword, but it was too heavy for her. After 2 days of practice, instead of feeling willing, she only knew how to complain and groaned with so much muscle pain. For this reason, on the third day, she agreed to use a lighter wooden sword. Marin even lamented that the butler had accepted a student without talent and worse than a child, but the man assured her she would succeed. Actually, he hadn't met a student with so much desire to practice for a long time, and Sebas motivated her by saying her persistence would certainly be rewarded. However, in the middle of their training, a servant suddenly entered, announcing in shouts urgent news to the butler. Apparently, the Duke would arrive soon, although everyone was sure he would remain away for much longer. Holding the wooden sword and hearing the Duke's name, Marin felt incredibly happy that Lord Gerald was already back. The Duke soon settled in his office as usual, while he heard that security had been provided to guard the castle, and his assistant had even prepared capable and trustworthy knights, so he wouldn't need to worry about the protection of the young girls and the little boy. However, Olive informs that Lady Daya had made a small request. She requested to be installed in a separate annex and that no one have permission to enter there. The Duke promptly asked the boy to attend to her wishes so that everyone would feel comfortable. However, there was another issue to be resolved. The young girl's debut in society was approaching, and he was worried about her reluctance to interact with aristocrats outside the house, since it would be difficult to find a woman to accompany the unmarried young girl in public places. Gerald knew that if he didn't want her to end up at the margins of high society, the debut couldn't be postponed and it was necessary to find that lady in waiting. However, she avoided any meeting with nobles in every possible way. On the one hand, the situation seemed like a dead end, and the Duke thought that if he had a fiancée, she could certainly accompany him, but that would be even harder to arrange. So to begin, he suggested that Olive make a list of candidates for lady-in-waiting and report when everything was ready. Upon leaving the Duke's office, Olive heard silent and timid footsteps behind him. It was Maureen, who couldn't wait until he called her and, luckily, found the assistant in the hallway. He asked what she was doing there at such a late hour, and the girl wanted to know how the trip to the south had gone. The Duke heard the sweet voice and called her again by the silly nickname of Temporary, but Maureen was happy to see him again anyway. Setting aside all formalities, she opened the doors with joy and greeted His Grace with a big smile. The boy comments that there was still a lot until nightfall, so he asked her to come in. He wouldn't admit it, but he was very pleased with her presence. Curious, he questions if anything had happened in his absence, but Maureen explains it wasn't anything like that. She just wished the boy would rest early because she thought it was unlikely he would sleep well over there, and, moved by a sincere desire, prepared all the necessary ingredients for him. Adding that, besides the mixture with the flowers, she brought something to make his sleep deeper and help him recover quickly, offering a glass of hot wine to the boy. Smiling, Gerald commented that the girl, like a little dog, was happy with her master's return and asked if she really had missed him so much during this period. Of course, Marin could barely contain her emotions at that point and confessed the truth, she did want to see him. But she soon denied what she had just said, asking the boy to stop comparing her to a puppy, and stated that she had come on business to help him sleep, so she wasn't going to listen to insults and mockery from him. Losing his composure, Gerald comments that hearing her voice, he felt he had finally returned home. Marin stopped before him and was incredibly satisfied to hear those sweet words after the long return. If she were sincere, she was very happy that he was there in perfect health. Soon, she offered to apply the eye compress she had used before and asked if he had managed to sleep during the trip with the help of the other one, which the boy confirms. Suddenly, the Duke removes his black satin blindfold that covered his clear eyes. Curious, she asks if it was okay for him to be without the blindfold after so many events, to which he responds that he thought so, which leaves her satisfied because she preferred to apply the compress directly to his eyes. That made our girl question if the plant was helping him, because Gerald could only remove that blindfold alone at night. And she smiles just at this possibility. Finally, she began the reading of the day. It was a tale of the prince and the pauper, and she began to read it aloud, with a velvety and gentle voice, as soon as she applied the herb dressing on his eyes. But the boy's head was far away. After his sister's death, Gerald had been suffocated by mourning for a long time. The image of her in a cold grave froze his heart, but the familiar smell of books, the delicate aroma of dandelions, and Marin's tranquil voice seemed to bring back a warmth he had already forgotten. He sat in his office, listening to the pleasant reading with his eyes blindfolded, and felt alive at that moment. Marin slowly read about the heir prince who had disguised himself as a pauper and who once had told a knight he was the prince, receiving mockery in return. Then the prince turned to an old man who was passing and told the truth about himself again. Again, he was mistreated since the old man called him a liar and threw a huge stone at him, so the prince could only run, dodging a rain of stones. She read about a life where lies and truths intertwine, where the false becomes the truth, and vice versa. This gave the Duke a perfect idea. The next morning, Gerald called Marin to his office and said something she certainly didn't expect to hear. "Marry me," and he made a point of pronouncing her real name, Lady Marin Schwentz, a girl of noble birth who now stared at him completely shocked. And that's where I'm gonna leave you guys today. Oh my gosh, I genuinely cannot get over how good this story is. The story is called Engaged to a Blind Duke, and it has completely taken over my brain, and I'm not even mad about it. I mean, Gerald is so different from the usual Duke. He's blind, mysterious, broody, ridiculously handsome, and surprisingly soft when it comes to Marin. I don't know. Something about him being blind with the blindfold is kind of sexy. The little moments between them are what really got me. The way he's always grabbing her wrist, the teasing, calling her his temporary, the dandelion compress scenes like the slow burn is doing numbers on me. And don't even get me started on that walk under the moonlight when he took off his blindfold for her. I was screaming. So yeah, I made it all the way to chapter 24 for you guys, and I really hope you loved this as much as I did. If you enjoyed it, please drop a like, leave a comment, and let me know you want more, because I'm dying to keep going with this story, and I really want to bring you the rest of it. The more support this video gets, the sooner I can come back with the continuation. Kisses, and see you next time.